What is happening, party people, and welcome to Countdown to Classic. This is a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Each week we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated Classic servers. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and this is a show where it's not my opinion on World of Warcraft that counts, but yours. If you're new to the show, Countdown to Classic goes through your expert input on everything relating to the sure-to-be amazing World of Warcraft Classic. If you've been following the show lately, you'll know that we've been lucky to have a deluge of former World of Warcraft devs put their hands up to come on Countdown to Classic. And today, we will finish the trilogy of dev interviews with Alex Brazie. Alex worked on Monster, Raid, and Encounter design, amongst other things, during his time at Blizzard. And whilst he was there during the vanilla days, this interview does also touch on TBC and onwards content, which was just great to hear about as well. But we definitely do discuss classic principles as well, so you're sure to enjoy the whole of the chat. So please do be sure to catch it all. Now, if you are enjoying these in-depth interviews that Countdown to Classic brings you on a regular basis, then please do visit the show's Patreon page to see how you can help support Countdown to Classic to continue to bring you even more of this kind of content that you're now so used to hearing on the show. Alternatively, you can also help the show out by mentioning the show to a friend, perhaps in-game, or talk about what you hear on Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, or wherever you're actively discussing things. Follow me on Twitch at Countdown to Classic, or leave the show a review on iTunes. It all helps. If you want to hit me up with some feedback, or submit a memory lane or anger management of your own, or just say hi, then you can always reach me at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com as well. If you can't get enough of me for some reason too, then please do also check out my other podcast, The Cinephiles. That's SINERFILES.com. If you haven't already, for some great comedic takes on all your favorite movies that I do with two other jokers over there. But with all that said, let's get to Alex Brazie and today's in-depth interview. All right, it's time for another Countdown to Classic interview, and today it's time for another very special interview, and I'm lucky enough to again be joined by a former World of Warcraft developer, and this is obviously something that the show has been building towards, getting more and more voices from the people who were there building the game back in the day that we all know and love. And today we're talking with Alexander Brazie. Now, sorry, have I pronounced that correctly? And also, do you prefer Alex or Alexander?
That's a question that's gone back and forth a few times over the years. I'm not even sure my family knows. We go by Brazie and just make the hard and Alex is fine.
Okay, thanks so much for joining us today, Alex. I really do appreciate it. Now, if people aren't aware, there's obviously a number of things that you worked on within the game, and you've also been involved recently with an AMA over at Reddit with John Staat and some other developers. Obviously, John has his book that's gone through just a wildly successful Kickstarter campaign. What are your thoughts on when obviously tell us about your friendship with John, or your connection with John, and your thoughts on what he's done with his book?
John for getting back up after the first two defaults and pushing to get the book through. John, it goes back kind of an odd direction, but so my first connection with World of Warcraft was back during the Tri-Horde push. That was Undead, Orc, Tauren, I believe. And back then I joined in with a guild of people who some people who worked at Blizzard and their friends, and later on that transitioned into people that I actually knew when I joined Blizzard. Now, the story about John in specific, though, was that I'd heard stories about John before I had met John. And probably the most prominent one was, some of the stuff about his personality. He's a very loud, big personality, right? So John and I really got to know each other when we both joined a Blizzard-only guild. So one of the things that happened was, I was a college student. That's when I worked on Cosmos, which was a community UI project. I was very fortunate to basically be the coordinator lead for. So when I joined Blizzard, some people there who had formerly been at Blizzard told me, "Oh, well, you're not allowed to be in a guild and work at Blizzard as a designer. It's considered a conflict of interest." I'm like, "That's strange, but okay." So the day I joined, I actually said goodbye to my guildmates, which was unexpectedly painful, not because of the loss of the friendships alone, but because just about a week beforehand, we had opened on Courage, and I had been the guy who had the black resonating crystal and the scepter on my server. So my guild had just spent months getting me all of this stuff, and then I had to basically say, "Sorry, guys, I need to go make the game that we're playing." But anyways, so at that time, John was doing Molten, or not just Molten Core, but Onyxia runs. He was one of the guys hollering people to get them in, to get them together to actually do it, because he really wanted to see that content, right? So I actually was one of the, I was one of the few Warlocks in the game who was in this guild. It's a very, very small horde guild at the time. And so we all would funnel in there, and then it was my job to farm up about 50, 60 shards to get 40 people there, let them hearth home, teleport them out again. So over time, John and I just kind of would grumble together in channels about how long it took to get everyone else there. And he was one of the people who would always be there ahead of time to help me get the first summons going through. So.
All right. Well, if I can just pick your brain, well, here's what I'll do. How about I sort of introduce you a bit better to the people listening and give people a little bit of a background into your resume within the game. Now, tell me if I leave anything out by all means, but you worked on monster, dungeon, and raid design, and you joined the company soon after the game launched, as you mentioned. You were there from about 2005 to 2012. You've worked on event design, spawning, boss fight design, pet battles, overhauling warlock spells. You also mentioned that you worked on spawning the battle at the Dark Portal, putting abilities on most of Outland. You spawned the entirety of the Underbog, as well as the Ring of Blood, and a ton of other stuff, as you say. And as you mentioned earlier, you also did some work on the Cosmos UI with volunteers from the community. Now, is that a pretty fair assessment of your involvement with WoW?
I'd say pretty much so, right? It was alpha tester first, then found modding. Modding I did for fun. The work I did in modding ended up being really popular within WoW. And I leveraged that into a short position at Microsoft. Didn't like Microsoft. Came down to Southern California, where a guy named Mark Kern invited me to a company that was not Blizzard at the time. It was called Red 5. Worked as a producer there very briefly. Didn't really have a good match with the chemistry there. And he recommended I go and talk to people at Blizzard, which, had been one of those things I had dreamed about doing when I was 12 years old. And I remember telling Mark, I'm not good enough to work at Blizzard. And he kind of just looked at me and he's like, "You're better than most of the designers they have there." And I was like, ouch, that's kind of harsh. It was right at the time, but I think he saw the potential. And so he, said, "Hey, go call up Jeff Kaplan. I'll give you his phone number and just have lunch with him and see if you get along with him." And we did that, and then it was Jeff, Tom Chilton, and Rob Pardo, and we just kind of geeked out and talked about the game. And at the end, they're like, "Why don't you come join us and see how it goes for a few months?" And I stayed for the next 7 years.
Well, I've got a million questions already arising from what you've just said. I just to tie off on you a little bit, just to give you a chance to let people know what you're doing now. What are you working on now? Do you have a plug for anything that you're doing online at the moment?
Oh, goodness. So after I departed from Riot, which was, I think, about 3 years ago, 3.5, teaching game design courses. And right now I'm actually working on a online course for aspiring designers, right? Someone wants to learn how to do game design at a little bit of a better level than what you can get off of, say, watching YouTube videos and podcasts. It's kind of more explicit, walk you through different design patterns, different ways of thinking, and help you kind of just understand what the role of a designer is within an organization, as opposed to just all of the things that go into game development. In addition to that, I've actually been working with Moon Studios on Ori and the Will of the Wisps, which is the sequel to Ori and the Blind Forest. And I'm working with a couple of other people on unannounced titles, because a lot of people will contact me and be like, "Hey, can you look at our product? Tell us where it's going well. What do we need to improve on the design?" So I do consulting for that probably 2 days a week. And then I work the other 3 with Moon, helping them out with their projects.
Okay. Well, if you're comfortable, don't be shy. Throw out the website. Where can people find you?
Me at zelnath.com or at Twitter at Zelnath. That's XELNATH.com. And I have just tons and tons of stories of my own about my time working on Warcraft, particularly Burning Crusade. And it was actually when I started blogging that it created kind of this internal PR crisis in Blizzard. We started asking, well, is this something an employee should be able to do? And I remember John was one of the first people to speak up and say, yeah, I think you should be able to do it. And so, John and also J. Allen Brack, actually said, this is the kind of thing that we should allow to keep happening. And so they stood up for me, and I got the chance to keep blogging and just talking about my personal story. And, that actually eventually led to John being able to, launch his book years later, and just been really fortunate to have these kind of people, to interact with, learn from, and grow.
Well, I'll take you back to some things that you said earlier, because I know some listeners would be jumping up and down thinking that I've buried the lead and I've forgotten a few things already, that some great tidbits that you mentioned. So taking that half a step back, you talked about that Blizzard only guild and people often ask about, which developers were actually playing the game, to which extent. I mean, obviously you guys are playing the game, but talking hardcore raiding and things like that, how involved were the people that were making the game? What went on? So talk about that Blizzard Guild. Who was there? What was happening?
Well, there's a certain amount that I don't want to divulge because, if they're still going, which I'm not sure if they are or not, right? It's not my build, not my place to out them.
Yep.
But at the time it was organized by a guy who I don't know, he won't mind, Jeremy Wood. He was the kind of the raid organizer at the time. And he went around gathering up a bunch of the engineers who were also in kind of the same predicament as I was. They just joined. They felt like there was a conflict of interest. And 4 of the producers, I remember J. Allen Brack was one of our healers. Lee Sparks was involved. I don't remember which class he was playing at the time. Alex Mayberry, who eventually went over to form his own company, which was previously called Cognitive Code. I'm pretty sure Carlos Guerrero was there. It was kind of amazing. So we went from calling them the producer team to the healer team because they handled all of the healing for the raid. And I have to admit, we were not the best raiders at this point, right? Most of us had been in Molten Core once when we accidentally zoned through from Blackrock depths, right? And so between a lot of the people on the team who worked there, engineers and producers, and we've had a bunch of artists filling in on TPS, I remember, as well as our friends, right? 40 people is a lot to draw even from a Blizzard guild, right? So we all got together. We would consistently show up, and they kept us alive even when we would stand in fire, which was an incredibly common scenario in those days. But it actually had a really positive effect, right? Because prior to this, there was not a lot of big raiding groups. There was maybe Alex Afraziabi with Fires of Heaven, and I think Jeff may have still been in FOH at that point, but he was pretty busy. So there wasn't really a lot of active raiding going on with the initial dev team, right, out the gate, because they were still building the game and their life was tough. But once we started raiding together, and we had, people who understood we got a crunch coming up, we're not going to raid for the next 2 weeks, etc. It meant that we had internal feedback loops against the content we were playing. We all of a sudden understood the importance of things like, oh, hey, decursive is really powerful. How do we include the important parts of this without, eliminating it, right? We were able to make better decisions, not only as designers, because, at that point it was, Jeff Goodman, Greg was not there yet. Joe Shelley. I'm thinking of Scott Mercer and a couple others. I can see his face, but I can't see his name. He was one of the level designers, right? Anyways, so these people would raid and often would even work on the raids, and they'd done formal raiding in EverQuest and things like that. But it meant that some of the feedback you got, right, was not as experiential or as hands-on from experienced raiders because, if you're an engineer who has been I played solo EverQuest, then it's not the same as, oh, hey, 30 of us just played this together. Here was our experience, and here was, how it went for us. And it actually improved things, right? Because you have more buy-in from, oh, hey, we need to fix this issue. Holy shit, you're right. That is an important issue. Or you might even have things like, oh, hey, we've noticed this issue. We've solved it on the engineering side. We just need design to sign off on it. And that was a much easier process when you had people that actively worked together. But at the same time, there was a dark side. So about this dark side, I'm actually going to call myself out because when I joined Blizzard, it was basically my first serious, career out of college. And I was loud and I was obnoxious, and we'll just say my social graces had left a lot to be desired. So we were at some point, someone decided that it would be a great idea, because I organized things and I was a designer, to be the Warlock group leader for the 40-mans. So I remember in Burning Crusade, we were going to Serpent Shrine Cavern, I believe it was. And so there was me and 3 other Warlocks at the time. We had to coordinate how to handle banishes or enslaves on some fight. I think it was the Demon Hunter fight in Serpent Shrine. And that would have been fine. But I remember now explicitly. Sorry, forgive my wandering. It was explicitly the fight with all the Murlocs in it. Mm-hmm. So Warlocks being a very significant AoE damage source with Seed of Corruption, which was broken as heck at the time. Mm-hmm. We had to basically coordinate very well to, basically blow up the Murlocs so the raid didn't die. Assigned me and 1 Warlock on the left side and the other 2 Warlocks on the opposite side, and that was it. And for some reason or another, this young woman, her game name was Mather at the time. So she was one of the Warlocks, very consistent, hardworking, or she's one of our best, probably the best actually in terms of responsibility. For whatever reason, was not where she needed to be and was across the room on the wrong side, and no healer could reach her. And I kind of let my own ego get into it, and I just ripped into her. I'm like, Mather, what the fuck are you doing? Mm-hmm. Why are you over there? Get to where you belong. Get over there. Oh, God, you're dead. You've let us down, right? Visibly over voice comms in a 40-man raid, right? Mm-hmm. So let's just walk through the problems there, right? One, I didn't actually understand the fight mechanics, and that she had been knocked away by a stomp effect right. by the character. There's nothing she could have done to prevent it. 2, critique in the middle of the raid, completely pointless. 3, calling her out in front of a group instead of in DMs, right? And not seeking to find out what happened before expressing my anger. Finally, she was the wife of the technical director at the time on World of Warcraft. Let's just say when I came in the next day, he called me into his office and he was not happy. And I don't think he ever became happy with me again for the remainder of my time there. And so until he went off to go on Titan, I had a strained relationship there with the engineers, because it's really hard when someone finds out, oh yeah, the boss hates this designer. So that was pretty awkward. But it taught me the lesson, right? To
Well, it's one of those things that a question that arises from that is, and it seems like such a silly one at times, but the community often says things like, Blizzard staff, are they just like us? And I presume the answer is going to be, yes, we eat, we drink, we go to the toilet, we play the game just like you guys do. But in terms of the way in which you play, did you find any difference with your involvement with the game and the way in which you consumed it?
Just the rate at which we could consume it. We often had to be slower, or we had to stop sooner. My favorite example of that was that we knew that Illidan was the end of Burning Crusade for us, right? Because when Sunwell came out, there was just no way we were going to be able to continue working on Lich King and Raid at the same time. So to us, beating Illidan was the end of the content, right? We knew there was simply no way for us as the organization that we were, with the hours of crunch planned ahead, to actually be able to continue enjoying the game. So but because we knew that, it was also more understanding, right? Which we reframed how we approached things, and we said to the team, this is what we're going to do. We're killing Illidan 3 times. We're going to play as long as we can to do that, and then that's it. If we don't get the loot, it's over. Everyone's free to go raid with other guilds, but we are going to stick together till we hit that milestone. And The producers were great, and they even would make sure that no meetings were scheduled, such that we could all, in the evenings go get together, organize. A lot of us played from the office, do the raid, and then shut down and go home.
Did you guys go through similar problems, when obviously you make the jump over to expansions and the 40-man raid thing becomes, goes the way of the dodo, and you make the conversion to 25-man raids? You've just spoken about a raiding with the Blizzard crew. Was there some odd internal discussions about who wasn't going to make the cut, or did you go through the same motions that everyone else did?
Absolutely. It was interesting, right? Because I was, there when the discussions about Karazhan and 10-mans, how this is going to be a completely different experience, right? One of the challenges for me when I started was figuring out how combat design was going to work for bosses in Karazhan, right? Because in Molten Core, you could guarantee you're going to have Warlocks, probably at least 2 Warlocks, if not 4 Warlocks. You could do a fight like Gar or Geddon, where you're banishing things constantly. Yeah, it was Gar, right? Gar, where you're banishing. And switch to the 25s and the 10s, all of a sudden it had to be like, well, what does this really mean? Are we kicking out friends? Are we going to, at that time, the guild was about 60 people. So the question is, can we do 2 25-mans? Do we scale up? Do we scale down? How do we decide who's going and who's not going? And in that case, the problem really solved itself, right? Some people who felt disheartened or were looking for a good excuse to quit did, right? They're just like, I don't really want to move on to the next tier. I want to just solo. We had the rule that anyone who wanted to stay in the guild could stay in the guild, right? Guilds at that point had a UI cap, but did not have a in-game cap. So we would just keep inviting people who wanted to be in the guild. And so then we'd have separate groups for people who were raid qualified. We made it about gear and preparation and then consistency. And so with a little bit of communication and cooperation, we figured it out. But I'm for sure. The thing I remember most, though, is we actually decided to double down on 10-mans at the time. So instead of it just being like the 2 10-mans, I remember there was one run by me and a guy named Bloody Wolf. He was the healer at the time, and I was still playing the Warlock. And so we would organize a 10-man, and then the gentleman I mentioned before, Mike, I won't tell you the rest of it. Mm-hmm. Mike had his 10-man group. So that worked very cleanly. We didn't have to raid 10-mans together. 10-mans were more of an intimate, trusting experience. So he would, Mather would go with him. I would then have to find a tank, and he would have him and he was a shaman healer, and I had my shaman healer. And so it worked out very nicely. We had a Warlock, a shaman, and a tank in both groups. That was kind of key to.
Now, when you say Mike, the old Simpsons gag comes to mind, and I won't sort of put you on the spot too much, but you do the old I don't want to give away too much information. Let's call him Mike M. No, wait, that's too obvious. Let's say M. Morheim.
No, I'm not going to do that. That was not like Morheim. He was in one of these. He was in the guild for a while, but He didn't raid actively. He was actually really busy dealing with the Activision merger, I think, around that time. Okay. Anyways, no, this is just another guy at the office. Yep. I think he's moved on from Blizzard at this point.
Okay.
Anyways, so that kind of created the original 2 10-man raiding groups, and Bloody Wolf and I were super consistent, and Mike and his wife were super consistent. So that kind of became the bedrock. And then the third group, I think, was run by, I want to say it was the same guy who organized the raids, but he may have been in Mike's group. Anyways, it doesn't matter. What we did is we picked another leader. Oh, it was Joe Shelley. I know he doesn't care if I call him out a bit. Joe Shelley became the leader of the third raid group, and that was really good because he was also one of those calm, responsible guys. So my raids would be a little more spastic, and they used to say that basically they would pause before the raid fight long enough for me to give a sermon about the fight and then ignore everything I said and pull. Whereas Mike's were more, sit back, watch videos, and then go. And then Joe Shelley's were basically somewhere in between. Okay. Because you have those different leadership styles and those different interaction styles. So people just migrated to the group that they had chemistry with.
One thing you mentioned earlier in terms of, and I'll move on from this soon, but when you talked about the people that played and the roles that they played, I don't know why, but I sort of laughed a little inside, and I can't quite put my finger on why, but I think I can guess, in terms of when you say that J. Allen Brack played the role of a healer, and it's just something I wouldn't have thought for some reason. How did he go? Was he a decent healer?
He was a phenomenal healer. He and Alex Mayberry, even Shane DeBeery, right? They were all great healers. They would just joke like, well, basically we just use your add-on. We put a whole bunch of raid bars on our screen, and then we just move up out of the fire and then fill up the HP bars. And so they said, well, it was just like their own regular job, because their job of a producer is to keep the bars moving from left to right. So
another thing, you mentioned obviously that it was, a bit of a funny thing working on the game that you started out just playing yourself and loving. And the analogy that often comes to mind for me is, it must have been almost like for you, Charlie visits the chocolate factory, but what happens when Charlie starts working at the chocolate factory? What was it like?
Are you ready? I hate MMOs, and I always have. Only joined the WoW Alpha because my friend Tom Cadwell, who was a designer on Priest, asked, he's like, hey, I know you don't like these types of games. Will you jump in, check it out, and give me feedback on it? Because you'll give the kind of feedback EverQuest players won't. I was like, all right, sure. And it actually became more of a place that I hung out with because it was more of a chat room with a game attached than because I was really deeply in love with the game. If you look at most of the content that I made, it was actually trying to move the needle on Warcraft away from stand there and turret to, hey, let's move around, let's interact, right? Shade of Iran's a great example of that, where I wanted the players thinking and moving and interacting with the monsters, not just delegating every monster to a tank, dumping heals on them, and then pressing their DPS buttons as fast as possible. And that created a very interesting dynamic in the team, right? Because you had the old school raiders who were kind of like, well, patchwork is good enough. And then you had people like me who were like, but there's so much more we could do with this game. And it created good tension because, I think Jeff Goodman's a great example of someone who was really in the middle of that spectrum, right? And so we'd always be moving the bar forward, increasing the action level of the game, but also keeping an eye on the traditional values of, do roles matter, right? Do you need tanks? Do tanks get to do interesting things? And so that's an example of how WoW kind of changed and evolved over time, right? As new people, new perspectives came in, and people who had played only WoW came in and weren't attached to these old philosophies from EverQuest and said, hey, we can make this game better.
So outside of the kind of tongue-in-cheek, breaking news, WoW devs secretly hate MMOs headline that may come up from that, obviously say it tongue-in-cheek, but what percentage, I do completely appreciate where Blizzard is coming from in terms of seeking other opinions from other than just, the hardcore EverQuest or MMO fans. What percentage of the devs, I know it's hard to say and it was so long ago and it's a very, very rough guesstimation, but what percentage of the devs would you say perhaps didn't have MMOs as a favorite genre of theirs?
Oh man, of the design team, not many. I think I was probably one of two or three. I think it was me and me. Now Kevin played a lot of Ultima. There was like one or two others who just didn't really like MMOs before I left, but in general, they're mostly MMO designers. For the devs in general, there's a lot of people who had never played an EverQuest game, had never played an MMO, and weren't even sure if this type of game could succeed. A lot of people were like, EverQuest is doing so well. How are we possibly going to take even a fraction of their audience? A lot of people used to think that there was very little confidence that WoW was going to be a huge success when they were developing it back in Brown Box, right? And so it was only after launch when it took off, mostly due to the Blizzard reputation, right? I joined Blizzard because of the work they did on Warcraft 1, Warcraft 2, and StarCraft, right? My secret dream was to go over to the StarCraft 2 team or even to the Warcraft 4 team, right? Something like that. That was kind of my hope for what I was going to do while I was at Blizzard. But, it was actually pretty impressive, right? Because having people with different perspectives, meant that the art moved forward, that the things that they tried went above and beyond the core stuff that existed in an MMO, right? So I would say probably 90% of the game designers maybe 95 had played MMOs. The total devs, I would say probably about 30%. I know the animation team in particular did not play a lot of MMOs, and it was particularly pained for them because a lot of the gameplay that was built into WoW was not set up to support animation work. You couldn't really time attacks with spell effects and things like that very effectively back then. You've played Dark Souls at some point, right?
Yeah, I love Dark Souls.
Dark Souls is a great example of a game that is very animation connected, right? Perhaps too much so to the point that it feels a little clunky, that the only thing you can do once you push an attack is dodge, or sometimes you can't even dodge out of it, right? Mm-hmm. But for fighting a monster, it's great, right? A monster starts picking up his sword, he goes, ugh! And then he goes up in the air. Oh, you can't see what I'm doing, but I'm totally acting this out right now. My hands are up in the air, and he holds the sword up in the air. He goes, rah, 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 and then slams it down to the ground with a big slash, right? And you know exactly where you shouldn't have been. Now, we tried to replicate some of those types of experiences in Warcraft, right? With Anixia's deep breath, right? She took a deep inhale before she would release this big cone of fire. But it was really hard to see because the gameplay said, hey, facing and position and movement of the unit trump everything except spell casting, right? And at that point in the game, when we were working on Nixia, you couldn't lock the monster in place. You couldn't lock its facing. In fact, I'll even tell you a little development secret. To make the client smoother, right? A whole bunch of tricks were done in the engine. One, when you pushed a shadow bolt or another nuke on your computer, it would begin casting the spell locally before the server said, yes, you're casting the spell, and told all the other players to start playing the spell animation. So that meant you couldn't have a fixed animation time on a spell cast because talents could decrease it or whatever. So you had to have a start, a loop, and an end for a casting animation. And the second thing, right, is that, so the thing that they wanted to synchronize on all of the machines is the release of the missile. So if you pushed Shadow Bolt on your computer, it would start at 0 seconds, right? Mm-hmm. And it would go to everyone else, bounce around the internet, and then arrive at everyone else, we'll say a quarter of a second later. What it would include is not, hey, he started Shadow Bolt a quarter of a second ago, but rather Shadow Bolt needs to release at this time frame, which is time 2.5 or 3.5. And so the client then simulates, oh, well, I'm just going to truncate the cast time on the client to be whatever it needs to be. And then the Shadow Bolt will come out of the hands of the Cat Warlock at the same time on every single client. So that was one of the things we did to smooth out the gameplay. Similarly, was not done by saying the monster is looking at angle 0, pi over 4, pi over 2, pi over 3/4. It would instead be, it's looking at this person. So wherever this person is simulated on your local client, Anixia is facing them. What that meant was that if Nixia is doing her conal deep breath, which is a 60-degree fan in front of her, and for whatever reason, your tank has had a little bit of a lag spike and moved off to the right on your screen, but is stood still on the server, she's deep breathing or generally breathing in a different spot than everyone else sees. And so that led to a lot of the inconsistencies and why people would randomly die back in the day.
It's definitely interesting to hear some of the as you mentioned, the little secrets, the under the hood little things that are happening behind the client and the way in which it's delivered to us as information when we're playing the game. One thing I've got to pick you up on, though, you just mentioned in a sort of off the cuff passing comment, you wanted to always be on the StarCraft 2 team or the Warcraft 4 team. Now, when you say Warcraft 4, is that more hope and dreams from you, or is that a team that existed or does exist?
No, that was hopes and dreams for me, right? Because I had connected with the lore of Warcraft a little bit better, having been on the WoW team. But no, it was kind of clear that, at least for the duration of time that I was there, that it basically worked like this, right? I was working on WoW, I'd been hired with WoW because, that's what my modding had been good on. And frankly, a lot of the designers on WoW at that point were non-technical. I had a full CS degree. I'd been a programmer at Microsoft, program manager specifically at Microsoft, and was a fairly talented Lua scripter, right? So a lot of what I did was teaching other designers how to script and building scripts, pre-made scripts for them to reuse. And that's what I did early on before rolling into, the heavier development stuff. And so it was kind of just a good opportunity to get my foot in the door in my eyes. But, I loved StarCraft growing up. I thought it was like one of the most intriguing stories of self-sacrifice that had been out there. Diablo I had played a lot growing up, Diablo 2 particularly, but I didn't like the violence and the corpses. And, I remember walking into one of the rooms and seeing concept art of basically a bunch of swollen, undead monsters that popped out babies and women's corpses impaled on walls. And I just was like, I don't want to be in this room, let alone killing things in this room. And so I was really turned off by Diablo 3, even though, action RPGs have been my jam pretty much since I was, 13 years old. So, what did that leave, right? Hearthstone hadn't started at that point. And so, it's kind of like, well, maybe that's where my goal will be. Never really came to fruition, and I kind of developed a lot of friends and relationships on WoW.
So one last question for you in a kind of general, all-encompassing thing from what's arisen from what you've told us already. And you mentioned very, very early on when we started chatting that once you got to Blizzard, you just enjoyed pretty much geeking out with everyone. You mentioned names like Brack, Kaplan, people like that, and just being in that environment where you could sort of, I'm guessing, talk about common interests and things like that when you weren't working on the game. What was it like when you were, I guess, also at work, but perhaps when you were, in downtime, being around the Blizzard campus, hanging out with everyone, geeking out, as you say? Tell us a bit more about that.
Oh, wow. So dinner time, even during crunch time, was kind of the best. Often, so there were two phrases I was told. One, always have crunch dinner, and two, the most important decisions on WoW are made over lunch, not in meetings. And so I'll tell a couple stories here. One, I remember crunch dinners, right, which was they would bring out pizza, or in the really awesome days, they'd have steak and potatoes like once a month, just to kind of be like, here's a really good meal for everybody. And so we would all line up, we'd walk, gather our food from the troughs, and then sit down in this kind of central lobby area where they had the design meetings. And everyone would just sit down and talk about what they were playing, what they were doing. The WoW TCG had come out at some point. And so like, Chris Zierhut, who I've always looked up to, he's a little rough around the edges, but an awesome dude. It would sit down and actually talk about, how much he loved Magic and how many boxes. I think he bought something like 30 boxes of the classic WoW cards. And so I was like, all right, well, I'll get some too, right? And it kind of became a social experience where you talked about what games you were playing, what you were looking forward to. And because so much of your life at that point, I was straight out of college. I was used to just going all hours nonstop, right? That kind of, when you share that kind of space, time, and experience with people, 50, 60, sometimes even 80 hours a week, you just get really close to the people you're around, and you learn what they like and dislike. And it was a really awesome experience. But I don't want to undermine it. It was great, but I'd been really fortunate that at RIT, there was this group called the RIT, the Empty Sky Go Club, and the RIT Anime Club. And I had really strong social networks there that, talked about the games that were coming out, or shows, or, talked about this very, kind of, to most Americans, they don't know what Go is, right? It's this 19 by 19 grid with black and white stones. And I was completely taken with it. Ended up getting to 5Q, which is like 5 steps from like Shodan. And actually would travel around with these people to like play tournaments, basically board game tournaments, around the Eastern Seaboard. And, when you have that kind of experience and you get to see that it doesn't just, you go into the corporate world, or, as corporate as Blizzard was at that point, and seeing that didn't just get cut off and ended was really kind of a great transition experience, right? It made me feel more connected to the coworkers I was around. And, I have to admit, I was a little spoiled, right? Like at Microsoft, it was nothing like that. Everyone talked about what they were working on and what platforms were coming up, but discussions were all about popular media or the next movie coming out, and not about games or things you felt really connected to.
Well, I was going to ask what was the thing that sort of slightly rubbed you the wrong way about Microsoft, but it seems like you pretty much just summed it up there.
Microsoft was a mutual bad match. So I was really fortunate. I was an intern there, and through some things that happened there, I actually even got to go to Bill Gates' house and have dinner
nice.
with him and his VPs in the backyard. A lot of the interns did those summers. But the main thing was that it was a great organization. They treated their employees fairly well. I remember my manager was this lovely woman named Lauren Lavoie, and she was great. She tried so hard to get resources for me and help me find projects and things that I could do to be helpful. But ultimately, everything I worked on, it just felt kind of empty to me. And probably the thing I was most proud of at Microsoft was cutting features that didn't need to be in Internet Explorer before they got into Internet Explorer, because Internet Explorer was so bloated. And that kind of created an adverse relationship there, where it's kind of like, well, my best contribution is keeping unhelpful things out of a product, which means I'm becoming this filter or point of resistance for the people who've been at Microsoft working on these pet projects for a long time. It's just not a really happy job position. It's not what you aspire to be. I'm the no man, right? So going to Blizzard and basically being like, cool, I'm going to take these ideas, these crazy concepts, work with really talented and hardworking people, and figure out ways to make them an experience that 10 million, 20 million, players can really deeply enjoy. Way more appealing, way more exciting, and honestly, utterly terrifying.
Now, I promise everyone we are going to get into the specifics of what Alex worked on in World of Warcraft, but he's doing so amazingly well, and I've got so many questions that are just popping up all over the place from everything that you're saying, Alex. But one last final question, I promise, before we get into the specifics of things, just from what you've said there. Tell me the most surprising thing about, number one, Bill Gates' house, and number two, Bill Gates himself.
Okay, sure. So I'm sure any intern could probably have told you these two stories, but here are my favorites. So those of us who had been, chosen to go to the dinner at his house, were loaded up onto a bus and taken to a church, of all things. They had to walk to the church. They had metal detectors, and they would not quite strip search you, but check to make sure you didn't have any sharp objects or weapons. Mm-hmm. Fine, right? All telephones, all cell devices, all cameras were confiscated and labeled so you could give them back to you. And then the bus would arrive. It pulled up somewhere way out in the countryside, and you were unloaded into basically a bunker. And inside this bunker was just rows upon rows of cars, and everything in there from Aston Martins to Boxers to Ferraris, right? It was just kind of like a cool little walkthrough. You get to see all of these vehicles that he had. And then from there was a staircase down, and, the managers who were with you, right, which were basically the VPs of the product groups, were basically like, all right, do not turn left, do not turn right, go straight through. And as you walk through, you go down floor by floor, because this thing was built into the side of a cliff. And it was awesome. The thing I remember most, in addition to the incredible cherry wood, or it might have been really, really dark oak, the first floor in the house was a movie theater. And I mean a full-on movie theater with popcorn popper, a board listing what movies were showing in which room of the theater. And I don't remember if there was a bowling alley or not, but it felt like there could have been, right? The next floor was kind of more more home-like. One of the people commented that Melinda and Bill had badges that like everyone else did, but when their badges would walk through a door, it would change the lighting in each room to match their own personal preferences. Then walking out the back, so then you walk out through the back, and it's a little bit of a shock at this point, so I can only remember about half the night. You walk out into this very lovely terraced area where they had catering groups and this sprawling green, turf. It was like full on, well manicured grass. So you got there, and they'd grab food, and you sit down, and each of the different tables was for each of the different product groups, and the VPs of each product group were there. And after about all the students had been there, all the interns had been there for probably about 30, 40 minutes. Bill came down, walked down the stairs, said hello. And it was like a ripple effect happened in this room. Because prior to this, everyone is evenly distributed through the area and kind of just hanging around, talking to whomever they knew or socializing like any other social event. And all of a sudden, when Mr. Gates showed up, he was called Uncle Bill. It was the internal name at that time. Showed up. A swarm started, right, where people kind of wanted to go over and interact with them, but they're also too afraid to get close. And so there was like this 6-foot bubble around him that formed, where people would form a circle. They didn't want to get too close and touch him and violate his personal space, but they also wanted to be close enough to listen to hear what he was saying.
Mm.
So, ever the defiant one. I thought about, well, should I just go and step in that circle? And I was like, no, that's just kind of weird. And frankly, I feel like I know most of what he's going to say around. And I realized all the tables were emptied. And so all of the VPs of all of the other product groups were there, and no one was talking to them. They were just sitting there as all of the interns formed this giant horde around Bill Gates. And so I'm like, well, I can now have a 2-hour conversation with any one of the highest level people at Microsoft. I'm going to go do that. And so I did. It was really, really interesting. They immediately would crack jokes about how they had to go through this 3 times a year, and basically how they called it the ring of fear. They're great. Let's see. About halfway through dinner, we'd gotten food, and a little biplane flew down onto the water, and then, with the pontoons. I can't remember the things that an airplane uses to land on the water.
The pontoons?
And ferries. Pontoons. Thank you. See, this is why you went to English classes. The pontoons, ferries over, and holy shit. There was Melinda, and she was literally getting out of the airplane. I don't know if she flew it or if she had a pilot at the time, and then just walked through, waving to the kids, kind of shook her head at this giant donut of people around Bill, and then walks inside, and then comes down later and socializes. One more story about this. So this happened another night. So then they did 3 nights of this, and so I was there the second night, and on the third night, someone decided they really wanted to look around, and we were all told, do not go outside of the fenced-in areas, right? That's not where you're supposed to be. Just behave yourselves. Really wanted to get a look at the guy at Bill Gates' hot tub, which was this massive outdoor, installation. And so he's going over and looking at it. And the coolest thing is, this was back, 2005, 2006. He had these probably 50, 60-inch flat screen televisions over the hot tubs. You could sit back and watch TV or whatever. Well, one of the guys decides he apparently had too much to drink that night. He's going to get a really close look at the screens and tumbles over the side of the hot tub into the water. I was told it was about 30 seconds at most before 3 men with guns walked over, ordered the intern to get out of the pool, and then escorted him off the premises.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's a story for life for that person.
All right. That's America.
I love it. It's funny because I could think that Bill Gates's hot tub would likely be the antithesis of what a hot tub is supposed to be all about.
Who knows?
Yeah. Who knows what goes on? Exactly. All right. Well, look, thanks so much for sharing that story. That's definitely something that I was mildly interested in as in terms of not only when I say mildly interested in, I mean Microsoft. I don't know too much about Microsoft, but greatly interested in the personal life of Bill Gates. But maybe we'll extrapolate on that another time. But let's get into your work on World of Warcraft. Now, you mentioned that, and I'll start with something that I'm relatively keen to hear about, and that's the concept of monster design. And you worked on some monster designs, and I wanted to ask... What was, well, that's fantastic. You've worked on heaps of them. What were some of your designs that you were most and least happy with at the end of the day that you worked on?
Oh, goodness. All right. So if it's all right, I'd like to talk a little bit about the guy who taught me how to do MMO monsters.
Yeah, go for it.
So his name was Mike Heiberg, like I alluded to before. And he was an amazing mentor. He is. So I am loud, gregarious, and very creative. He is quiet, considerate, meticulous, and responsible. And so they paired the two of us up, and it was just a wonderful teaching experience because he walked me through the work that I had to do day to day, as well as the methodologies for handling the editor and working the tools. And it also meant that we would push each other, right? Mike's work is less creative than other people's might be, but it's very, very tightly coupled with good game mechanics design. And so I, on the other hand, would be super wild with my ideas and what my capabilities of what I could do, because I actually had access to the scripting language in WoW, probably about 6 months to a year before many of the designers were outside of the raid team. And so what that led to was a really great dynamic where I would brainstorm. He would set up the basic patterns. I would brainstorm raw ideas. We would sit down together and he would walk through really carefully through me. Here's why this ability works. Here's why this ability doesn't work. And we actually developed a kind of design guide for how to think through and prepare abilities that we put on the internal wiki for not only ourselves, but for every future designer to basically learn and understand how to design WoW style abilities. So I remember, I wish to this day I had a copy of that webpage, but you know what? It's locked up heavily behind bars at Blizzard Entertainment. But I remember the biggest things that he did were he created generalized patterns that we would find over and over again. If you find a creature, the big one was, you have 3 windows of response, right? You can do something beforehand to set up for it, lay a trap, buff yourself, begin channeling a big nuke to chunk the enemy down before you pull it. You can do things mid-fight or in between an ability, right? You can kick an ability to stop the spell from casting. You can move out of the way of an AoE, or you can cast a defensive spell to dampen the blow when you're about to take a big hit. And then finally, you can respond after an event has occurred, dispel a hostile effect from yourself. You can heal yourself up to full if you've taken a lot of damage, or just sit down, eat, and drink at the end of a fight. And then within those basic categories, we just came up with all sorts of things that can happen to encourage those patterns and disrupt those patterns, right? We could create monsters that would charge at you the moment you started fighting them. And so they would interrupt spellcasts when they charged into you. So all of a sudden, the best thing to do is to open with instant cast spells, wait for them to charge up to you, then start your nukes, right? Or you could have monsters that were going to run away. And so all of a sudden, these underused abilities like Curse of Recklessness or things that slowed down enemy movements such as Hamstring on the Warrior became more important on monsters that you knew were going to flee and run away. And this kind of built this fundamental for creating abilities and mechanics. And if I had to boil it down to one thing, it's this. If the player isn't going to respond to it, it may as well not be there, right? It's like, the only reason to keep something that doesn't create an opportunity for a player to prepare in the moment or recover from afterwards is flavor. And guess what? Flavor is a wonderful thing. There's a reason we have fireballs and shadow bolts. But if you really want to design combat mechanics about how players respond to it, how you communicate what's happening to the player, and finally, make sure that you tune it appropriately, such the warning, the risk, and all of that is appropriate to how capable you are of responding to a situation. So far, I know that was kind of a big download, but you've got your head wrapped around that part so far, right?
Yep, absolutely.
So using that as kind of the guidelines for what good abilities and bad abilities were, let's talk about some of the stuff that I'd made. So one of my favorite examples, an ability that had great potential and terrible delivery, was these creatures known as Ganarg. And they were a demon type that existed in, I think it was Nagrand and the place with the crystals in the Ogre Bluff. I'm forgetting the name of it at the moment. And these things were supposed to be really simple. At a certain point in time, they would stop what they're doing, basically turn into a mortar, and start lobbing these giant splashes of acid damage at you. And the idea was it was supposed to shoot the missile of acid wherever you were standing, and all you have to do is run around in a circle, right, avoiding the acid and kill the monster. Straightforward, right? Mm-hmm. Those kind of abilities could only be built like arcane missiles. And do you remember arcane missiles, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Channeled spell. So I had the clever idea, I'll change arcane missiles, but instead of it firing a missile at you, it'll fire a missile out of location. And so it'll go fire, explosion. Well, as it turns out, I didn't quite understand at this point in time the way that the game engine resolved targets. Specifically, that it resolved targets and damage when the missile was released rather than when the missile landed. What this meant was if you were standing in the target location of the monster's aim reticle, when it fired a single lob of acid, you would get hit even if you moved way outside of the AoE of the attack. And so we had basically created these death monsters that would fire rapid fire gouts of acid at you, and there was absolutely no way you could survive them. Okay, so that was a really bad example. So good example of how I learned from that one was just a total disaster. We had to cut that creature. But I took that lesson and then went back to Sam Lantinga, who was one of the greatest people to work with. Easygoing, understood the game and the gameplay, would help you whenever he could. Yeah,
I'm hoping he speaks to Sam soon on the show.
You'll love him. Sam is warm and engaging. Anyways, so when we built the Fellfire cannons off of the ridge, the Ogre Ridge, this time we actually built it so that they would fire a missile and then detonate a separate explosion when the missile hit the location. And this allowed the bombing run quests to exist, where you would fly your mount and then drop like missiles and bombs and things like that down onto the areas. And so I think it's a good example of a situation where you have the same idea, but based upon how you execute against it, you have a mechanic that doesn't work and a mechanic that does work and works the way you expected it to.
Well, here's how silly I am. I sort of just presume, when we talk monster design, I'm thinking, they've probably got, one team or one person that comes up with the look of the monster. Then they've got other people that come up with the abilities and all that stuff. But, I mean, from what you're saying, it's very much so all done in the one hit. Would that be the case? And if that is something that when you not only come up with the look, but also the abilities and the core mechanics behind a particular monster design, were there others that was there one that you can look at now and just go, I did that, that's my favorite, that's one of my marks on the game?
Oh goodness. So there is one that was super strong to me, and I want to call something out there. So the way it would work is, as a junior designer, you don't have calls on direction for what is going to be made in the game.
Okay.
Someone creates the art assets, and you figure out what abilities would work there, vet it past the senior designers. They sign off on it, you implement it, you find out what doesn't work, you take it to the engineers, they give you new features, you go. But one of the things I was utterly obsessed with all the time was pattern, shape, and avoidability, right? I felt like the best abilities in the game were the ones where you can see a threat coming, get out of the way, and move, and just that's it. That's just make this interesting, make the experience, make the dance of World of Warcraft interesting. And so there was this one ability I built for a elemental, and it was basically a little volcano. And the way it would work is this volcano would erupt from the ground, and then a little stream of lava would begin to pour out of it, drawing zigzag lines. And these zigzag lines at the time, I actually took these AoE effects from Core, literally graphical pools from Molten Core, because they were one poly, but had a great texture on them, and spawned about 300 of them to make these zigzag lines. And after 3 seconds, the entire thing would explode in a vertical gout of flame. And that was probably one of the first times where actual patterns, right? Things that weren't just, here is a circle, get out of it, were used for boss fights. Now I go and look at like videos of the new fights, and they have these really solid indicators and cones and shapes. And I really feel like that sort of direction, right, of creating these different shapes, these different patterns, these different movement styles for players has really sunk in not only into WoW, but into every other game made since then. You look at things like Wizard of Legend or even WildStar, right? And they all have not only these indicators, but really strong visual effects to sell the idea of, hey, here's the bad stuff. Here's where to not stand, and here's where you should move towards. But in terms of day-to-day monsters, probably the one people remember the most will be the elementals, that when you beat them, they split into two smaller elementals. And if you beat them again, they'll split into 4. And I just want to apologize. I'm so sorry, because that is the most annoying mechanic that I've ever played with.
When we talk about some iconic, early WoW monster designs that we got, like the Anubisath, Devil Saws, Princess Theradras, things like that, a thing that I wonder is, I presume obviously there were multiple people working on these monsters. Would there be competition to come up with a particularly cool design amongst yourselves, or did you always work together, or did you kind of want to, one-up each other?
I'd say there's a healthy mixture of both. The way that format would usually work is, so I'll talk about, I was brought in to spawn up, I think it was Terracar Forest, or put abilities on Terracar Forest. And the way it worked is, so Jeff Goodman, a gentleman whose name I've forgotten, and Jeff Kaplan and a couple other designers all came in, and we would sit down in a circle in the middle of the community area. And we would just literally go through the monster names one by one and come up with random ideas. And then we would usually riff off the ideas. So one guy would think of, well, maybe these things should basically squeak and squatch. I'm like, all right, well, what does that do? Well, that could silence you. Or silences are annoying. Maybe it just interrupts you. And then we would actually walk through the design process, thinking about the different permutations of ways of expressing the theme of the monster. Rams usually charged, Arakoa throw AoEs, fire elementals generally put burns and dots on you and exploded in fiery eruptions when they died, right? And would definitely try to improve the designs collaboratively. And then you would take those ideas, you'd go back to your own desk and you'd say, these work, these don't. I'm going to try something crazy on this monster, and I'm going to do something more safe on this other monster, just to kind of let you balance the sheer amount of time you have to spend building abilities, right? Because as much as I hate to say it, when you're making about 10,000, 20,000 creatures in an expansion, you don't have the time to give every single monster a unique ability. Some things need to have fireballs and blizzard effects, right? So it's a really tough balancing act, and you have to choose which monster you're going to go ham on. And in general, you go ham on the new model, the new visual asset, trying to find the thing that's going to go on those elementals, go on those fire things, go on those demons. What are the imps going to do? To basically find the breakout ability for each unique creature. And then you rely on what you already have for the others. At the end of the day, it's okay if wolves howl and summon other baby wolves, and Defias pillagers will always throw fireballs, right?
Mm-hmm. When we talk about things like dungeons and raids, and this is another field that you mentioned that you worked on, and the design of them, and we've obviously spoken with John in depth about, the vast amount of work that he did in designing a number of the dungeons and raids in the game. You joined soon after launch. Did you work on any of the vanilla dungeons or raids that perhaps weren't fully completed by the time you got there?
Oh, no. I think there may have been a misunderstanding. I started during Naxxramas. I played through Encourage, and I joined after Encourage had been completed. And so my first contributions to WoW were providing support work for Naxxramas and working on the early prototype stuff for Burning Crusade.
Okay, got you. That's more what I was wondering. Was Naxx fully done by the time you got there? But you said it was still, perhaps you might have been there just in the last couple of weeks or months of completion. What kind of input did you have into Naxx?
Sure. So I would say I didn't have much input at that point. I was in training, but I can tell you some stories about what the very first raid test on Naxxramas. I was actually invited to sit in this room we called the fishbowl with everyone else, and had a big projector on the screen on the side of the room, and so we could all pull all the designers in and watch the raids and give feedback on the fights. And I remember that the first fight that I ever saw, Souls by oh goodness, why am I blanking on the gentleman's name? To it. Anyways, Wyatt Cheng had been developing this fight, and the idea was that there was a live side and a dead side. As you killed things on one side, the souls would flow over into the other one and spawn on the other side. So basically, the whole point was to push things to the other half of your raid at a rate they could handle and no faster, but also not let things build up on your side so much that you got overwhelmed and died. And at that point in time, we didn't really have a good sense for how powerful players were really going to be. So the initial tests of that were absolutely devastating, right? Monsters were kind of easy to kill. And so they were just, the QA raid that was doing this was just funneling everything over to the other side, almost instantaneously, to the point where the other side just was getting absolutely obliterated by their own allies, and the other side was completely bored. So that spawned a whole bunch of conversations about, well, do you need to, does content need to move over there that fast? Do we need more spawns? Do we need fewer spawns? Do the spawns need to take longer to kill? And, I have to admit, I don't remember exactly what the decision was, but it was something along the lines of we're going to do fewer monsters. They're going to be less AoEable. And we're going to have a few that are really easy to kill, but are very dangerous, such that you don't send them over until the other team is ready and prepared to pick them up. And it was those kind of conversations that really informed a lot of the design, that went into Burning Crusade and beyond, right? When Wyatt worked on Lothad, that was a very heavily crafted, very carefully created raid fight because you couldn't heal. The only way to have any sort of healing effect or do significant things in that boss fight was to pop those little seeds. Do you remember that?
Well, I didn't raid Nax, but I've spoken extensively with some interviewees about it, and also have been walked through the encounter recently, albeit in the expansion, so it doesn't quite count. But I definitely know about it.
Okay, well, I won't bore you with the details too much then. But I remember just getting to sit in on a lot of these fights and observing how carefully and considerately all the designers thought about, well, what kind of classes are going to deal with this. Are you always going to have the Paladin tanking this version of, I remember the Four Horsemen, right? It was one of the hardest fights in that dungeon. It was far harder than Sephiron and probably on par with KT. And that was one of those fights where they were really, really careful to say, hey, we need to make sure that if a raid is bringing 4 warriors, that works, right? Or if they have paladins there, the paladins have a reason to be there? And it really emphasized that the design team cared about every class. And even though the class team, knew there was a lot of improvements they were planning on doing in Burning Crusade and beyond, that they wanted to make sure that everyone had a role, everyone had a purpose, and it wasn't just a whole bunch of patchwork fights, which is, you sit there, you burn your damage through your DPS as hard as you can, and you either win or you lose based upon fear.
Well, in terms of the Four Horsemen, you mentioned obviously the number of tanks that are required, and obviously some people are saying that there's perhaps even more tanks that are required than 4 for the Four Horsemen. Was that something that came into consideration where you obviously might have been testing it, or people were testing it themselves, and realizing the challenges that came up as they were coming up with their right?
Yeah, as I recall, I think the popular strategy ended up being 8, right? Yeah, 8 warriors on that fight. And that was because, so the original plan was you have the 4 horsemen tanked in the corner, and the 2 tanks will hold both horsemen together, taunt off of each other, and then run back. And what ended up being the problem with that was that these pulsing, stacking AoEs meant you had this super dangerous zone in the middle where people would be stacking both debuffs. And so the popular strategy actually became, have 2 tanks on each side. They swap off halfway through and then run to the other side to prepare for a taunt. And so, in a world where tanks didn't have to be warriors, that would have worked fine. That would have been great. You'd have a warrior tank and a paladin tank and a druid tank, right? And you just have people basically bring those specs or that gear with them. But at this point in the life cycle of WoW, they hadn't really evolved the paladin and the druid to be effective enough. And there was a moratorium on letting pets tank things in raids ever. It turns out that when you have a warlock who can instantly resummon pets, he will just spawn void walkers over and over again, and put 300 shards in his bag to basically prevent his raid from taking any damage. So a lot of that was a really tough situation where, you hoped, maybe 6 is enough and it's doable, but then players will always choose the path of least resistance, right? They will say, hey, we're going to pick 8. It's easier to coordinate, less damage on the individual tanks, and it means that we can just relax and the DPS has more time to beat the boss. So that always happens. When you try to do a very tightly coordinated fight, it's not going to go the way you thought. I remember in Karazhan, Nightbane the dragon with Skeletal Dragon. So there's this phase where the dragon goes up in the air, and the idea was at that point in time that a hunter or a shaman would use their high threat spells to taunt the creature onto them, because warriors have no way of dealing a AoE, aerial damage. Mm-hmm. But it turned out that it ended up being easier for everyone to just cease doing damage, don't even try to nuke the thing up in the air or throw minimal dots on it, and just handle wave spawns over and over again on the ground. And you just have to kind of prepare for that, right? You're never going to see completely how players are going to play through it. But when you're designing a fight, you look for what is the cheesiest path of least resistance that could exist here, and how do we prevent it?
Following on from some things that you said,
sure.
The next thing I want to touch on is you talked about, obviously, we've just talked about boss fight design and encounter design. What are some that you worked on later down the track, sort of outside of vanilla, just throughout the expansions? Are there any that you did have a large input in that you're quite proud of?
Wow. Hold on. Let me pull up the list here. Because it's kind of funny, because I always remember some of the ones that turned out the best were sometimes the easiest ones to build. And probably my best example of that is Lord Marrowgar, right? The guy had 2 abilities, and it was basically whirlwind, or no, 3 abilities. Whirlwind, right? Spin around the room really fast and just stay out of the way. Draw these big crosses, right? These X's of AoE. It's another example of the ground pattern stuff I was absolutely obsessed with. And lastly, impale an ally on a bone spike and then kill the spike to break him free. And a very simple fight, right? It's you walk in, you spread people out, and just don't stand in the fire, and you win. But the work that Alex Afrasiabi had done, right? He actually came up with the lines for the fight. It was something as simple as Bone Storm, right? It just kind of made people laugh, right? And I actually was a little flummoxed at the time. I'm like, really? We're going to call it Bone Storm? Do we have nothing better? He's like, no. It's going to be good. And it was, right? He understood that people like the kind of the slightly dirty joke, the really obvious, reference to a threatening ability, and the fact that these audio cues just immediately set you off and say, okay, cool. I'm going to step back and get out of this. Bits of polish that make those raid fights really last and make them good experiences. Another one I loved working on was the chess event, if you ever had the chance to play that.
Yes.
So, as you know, the chess event was basically this special rule game, right? Where you move around on a chessboard, and over time you press these buttons and kill the enemy king. Mm-hmm. Now, that was done by Patrick Nagel. He did the majority of the work on that, but Pat's scripting skills were good, but not super duper strong at the time. So they said, hey, just pair off with Pat, handle the engineering stuff he needs where possible, get him off to a good start, and if he needs anything else, help him, but he's driving it. Pat was one of those people who was wonderful to work with. He had this general idea of what he wanted, right? He's like, well, I don't want you to actually play chess, but I want to feel like chess is playing, and everyone is contributing to this common experience of a chessboard playing out. And so with a really clear vision, we built out the king gets to AoE, but the king standing next to anything is really dangerous. And the elementals are going to basically have AoEs and line attacks, so you want to not stand there. And that was just a fun one to work on, considering that it's a pretty easy fight at the end of the day. Right. The balance had nothing to do with your own gear. It actually became tedious for a lot of players because this fight never got easier over the course of their time. And so we couldn't tune it as hard as we would have liked.
Now, the Bone Storm reference, obviously, as well, for anyone listening, a huge Simpsons reference too. So that might have been what Alex was putting in the reference to as well. But moving on from that, one of the classes that you mentioned that you played, that I presume you've got a lot of experience with, and also something that you worked on throughout World of Warcraft, was that of Warlocks. And you mentioned, we talked about earlier how you had a hand in, as we say, overhauling their spells. So I guess I would ask what that means. Were you kind of assigned to that class, or were you just particularly passionate about them? And how did you overhaul or change the class over time?
Warlock was almost kind of a legacy thing. Mike Heiberg actually had done the initial design on the original Warlock, and one of the training exercises he did with me was walk through the abilities that he and Kevin Jordan had made for Warlock and explained what the philosophy was behind it and how the flow of the abilities was supposed to work. And so I got this really deep insight into what they wanted from it as opposed to the fear it, dot it, and just run away experience that it came out to be at launch. So I had been playing a Warlock pretty much until Death Knights came out. And in Lich King, Warlocks were kind of not the strongest class and were very hard to play. So I put them down for that expansion. In Mists of Pandaria, the early Mists of Pandaria, this guy known as Cynwise, Cynwise, made an amazing community post explaining how the design complexity of the Warlock had just utterly exploded. Right? That there were so many things going on that Warlock was more of a juggling exercise than a player agency exercise. And that's when the light went on in my head, and this forever changed how I approached games and game design. Once I realized that most MMOs, and the reason that I hated most MMOs, was that they are full of basically rhythm games, right? You just sit there and you go, fireball, 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 whatever, explosion, fire nova, frost nova, whatever, and just are cycling abilities in a particular order. Then the game becomes about mastering that order, hitting your cooldowns every single time they're up. And they're not about decision making, except do I remain on this target or do I switch to AoEs? Now, part of that is fair. Right. Part of that is basically if you look at an MMO as a giant chat room with a game attached to it, that's fair. You don't want a lot of complex, decisions to make. But I looked at it and I felt like it was a missed opportunity. So when Mr. Pandaria came around, Chris Kalecki, working on the Monk for that expansion, and then owning the Warlock since I think the early mid-Lich King, basically came to Greg Street and said, "Hey, look, I'm completely burnt out. I'm working on Shadow Priest, and just my ideas for Shadow Priest and Warlock, they're merging. They're feeling more and more the same all the time, and I don't feel like I'm bringing my best design work to Warlock anymore. What can we do here?" And Greg didn't have an answer, but said he'll think about it. I happened to share the Cynwise post with him and said, "Hey, I think this is really on point for the problem with this class. And, I played one for years and years and years. How are we going to fix this?" And he's like, "Well, do you think you could fix it?" I was like, interesting. I'm like, "Well, I've never done class design before." So he's like, "Well, just come up with some ideas and pitch it to Chris." And so I pitched it to Kalecki, and Kalecki was like, "Oh, these are great ideas, but I can't implement this. This is just too broad. There's too many changes here. I can't pull this off." And I was like, "Well, what if I do it?" He's like, "I would love that. If I could just focus on Shadow Priest and Monk, that would be wonderful." I was like, "Okay." And Greg, basically went to Chilton at that point and said, "Hey, we're going to have Alex take a stab at completely redoing the Warlock." Prior to that, my previous boss, Alex Fraziabi, had gone over to Titan. And so I was kind of floating in the org without a manager. So they made Greg Street my manager, moved me on to the class team, and then said, "Cool, we're going to have you work on two things: expansion, pet battles, and Warlocks. You decide how your time is split between them, and write a proposal, and we'll go with it." So at that point, I had been playing a Warlock 3 years before that and had put it down for 2 or 3 years. I knew that I wouldn't alone be able to get an insight into how that class needed to play in the modern raiding environment. So I reached out to some of the people I had raided with back in the Burning Crusade and later days, and they had a few ideas, but generally the Blizzard group was pretty tired and very focused on getting expansion out. So I said, "Hey, I want to reach out to some people in the community who've been major players, who have given us great feedback on raid bosses and encounters, and really get their insight into where they think the problems are." And Greg said, kind of scratched his head. He's like, "Well, I think that's a good idea. It's how we should probably communicate with players. We don't really do it that way here." He's like, "You can," and I'm like, "Well, I really want to try this." He's like, "Well, I can't approve this, but if you choose to do it, I can't cover you if you get caught. I'm like, all right, cool. I found a group of about 12 warlocks who were really, really into the game, who really understood high-level raiding. A couple friends as well, because I wanted to get people who weren't hardcore raiders in the feedback loop, and created basically a channel on Gmail or the Google forums or whatever it was back in the day. Mm-hmm. And we just basically said, hey, here is the overall idea for the Warlock revamp. We're going to pull all of the classes back to their innermost core idea. All right, the specs. They're like the sub-specs. And that was for Affliction, it's all about dots. It's all about nukes. And for Demonology, it's going to be about toughness. And I actually pitched, I think we should make the Warlock a tank. And that got some death stares from around the room. Because people were like, how are you going to do that? Tanking is hard. Designing tanks is really difficult. Take a stab at it, and we'll see what happens. The Affliction went off without a hitch, right? Affliction was pretty close to where we wanted it to be. Mm-hmm. I pulled away some of the talents that gave you free corruptions and basically said, all right, corruption is the 3 or 4 dot spec. That's what you do. You manage those dots. That's your core job. Everything else is auxiliary, cooldown, summoning, pets. You're not supposed to spend a lot of time thinking about them. Then I went to Destruction and saying, okay, Destruction is all about your nukes. You're only going to have 1 dot on this spec. It's going to replace corruption, and you're going to have a inner loop about empowering and increasing your own temperature that you can then unleash on enemies around you. And so the original idea was that Destruction would basically be cast these fire spells, immolate the target, conflagrate to detonate your explosion of power, whether on a single target or an AoE, and roll with it out really well. And for Demonology, I started playing with it, and actually my first stab was at a multi-pet class, right? I just wanted to give them 3 different pets. They could have all of their pets out at one time, and that instead of having attacks be based around you, you said you would have your Void Walker, your Succubus, your Imp out, and you would basically be pushing buttons that made each one of them attack and do a thing. And, well, it turned out this caused a lot of concern from the engineers. All of a sudden, Warlocks were going to be 4 characters at all times. All of a sudden, they had to do a lot of extra work to support multi-petting. Like, that hadn't been done before. How do we handle the UI? And finally, as I started building that, it actually kind of really sucked. So the way it basically worked is you had 3 turrets standing around with you, right? And a Void Walker running up and meleeing stuff. Mm-hmm. And so it felt like your character never did anything. You were basically a totem. Version of the shaman pattern, where a shaman is in there doing things and has totems around him that are supporting these passive buffs. It instead felt like you were the totem, and here were these monsters that were basically casting instant cast or very quick cast spells, spamming attacks. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but if you have 4 units that are all casting cast time spells, or let's just say the Void Walker was meleeing in that case, mm-hmm. So 3 units doing cast time spells. Who do you kick? Who do you interrupt? Who do you silence? And the answer was that I realized, having looked at that design, that it was an uninteractive, uninteresting, unresponsive design. You just couldn't actually have agency over a Warlock in this scenario. So once I saw that, I knew I had to kill the whole design, at which point I then pivoted to the Warlock tank. The Warlock tank was based upon the fact that there were all these toughness talents, right? Soul Link, extra health in classic WoW. So my experience as a Demonology Warlock was I want to get the long-lasting Infernal. I want to get lots of health. I want to basically be the really tough guy whose pets are doing work around him. That was my fantasy back when I played classic. But it never really came together. Wait a minute, we just killed Illidan a couple expansions ago. We have this really cool model. Illidan has all of these awesome abilities. They're not being used anywhere because we're not doing Demon Hunters, and we have no plans to do Demon Hunters in the near future. So I discover. Now, 3 years later, it's a little different. took the Metamorphosis cooldown, which had basically been just a 30% more damage for a few seconds, and said, what if I make that a tanking mode? And so instead of being like a DPS cooldown, let's make it a tanking cooldown. Let's make it like bear form. And so you could basically swap out down your DPS to increase your survivability, and it would make things like Illidan or did you play through Encourage? Do you remember any of the fights we needed a shadow resist tank?
I joined right around the time of Encourage, so I didn't really get too involved with that whole deal.
Well, so basically the way it worked is you had to have a couple people with shadow gear and poison gear to handle the twin emperors, right? And someone had to basically tank and switch those guys off. And I thought, well, we've been doing this. We did this in Gruul. We did this in Twin Emps. We wanted to do it again in ICC. It was like, this seems to be a pattern going to the game. Let's codify a caster tank into the game. Just say, this is your caster tank and roll with it. Maybe in the future we can make one of the mage specs a caster tank as well, bring the balance back around. And so I actually built a whole bunch of mechanics into this. And this crazy thing was with, I think it was reducing damage by about 40% and giving you just a whole bunch of flat survivability. It worked. It had a fatal problem. And sorry, I'm sure this is more time talking about Warlock tanking than you ever cared.
No, not at all. Please. It's fantastic. Don't feel the need to stop.
All right. Well, as it turns out, it was great, but it was too great. It was more effective because it scaled with just your DPS gear than any other tanking class in the game. So even if I made it so that it was equivalent, it was easier to build a Warlock tank than it was to build a regular tank. So you had one set of gear. Your best set of gear was the best tanking gear, the best survivability gear, and all you had to do was push this magic button that switched you between I am doing tons of damage in PvP to you can't kill me in PvP if I have a pocket healer. And anyone who played with Ret Paladins circa early Alterac Valley knows how much of a problem that can be. Anyhow, so at that point, Greg came in and was like, look, this works. It's kind of fun. But we can't possibly ship with this for two reasons. One, we don't have the time to figure out a solution to the item problem, right? Two, we can't tell every tank in the game, hey, a Warlock is better a tank than you. And finally, how do you go on? At this point, he was our major channel to the community. Said, how do you go onto the forums and say, hey, we are deleting the DPS spec for Warlock. You no longer have any of these abilities or attacks you had before. Now you are instead just this tough guy with cool wings running around tanking shit. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty serious. I really don't have an answer for that. He's like, all right, well, how do you resolve it? And so after, honestly, some pretty agonizing pressure from the class team, I realized I had to pull it. Can I just tone this down probably 50, 60% and just leave it as like bear form as a glyph? Because we just added the glyph system and we're trying to make it more significant. And they were like, sure, that's fine. Just do that. Leave it as a glyph. It's bear form for a feral druid and figure out a DPS spec for Warlocks. And so at that point, I had basically a month left to go before we had to shut down everything for Mrs. Pandaria launch. And at that point, I basically came up with this DPS cooldown whose duration was based upon how much of a resource you had built up. So as you attacked and did abilities, your meter basically worked like a rage bar, and you hit Metamorphosis. All of your abilities changed from a color and visual effect that you were familiar with to one that was different and indicated it was a demon version of the spell, and did 30% more damage. Which was really cool because when you had these limited DPS windows, you could then toggle it off and say, cool, I'm going to go back to building. And when the monster is weak, I go to max damage. And it gave you this sense of really finely controlled agency over when do I get to be a demon, when do I not be a demon, right? It decoupled you from the idea of having a cooldown that decided everything for you.
Now, if I can ask about, you mentioned that you were playing as a Warlock prior to joining Blizzard. Is that right? It was before you actually joined. You were involved. Yeah. Okay. So knowing I recently did it. Okay. first character. I recently covered on the show, just in the last episode, a patch history of World of Warcraft, and we did a little bit of a blanket coverage on everything that happened. Obviously, every class got a major update at one stage of vanilla, and the Warlocks were the first class that got addressed in patch 1.6. So just going through, taking into account everything that you've just said that you had in mind for some changes for the for the Warlock class eventually through expansions, if I can cast your mind back to those early vanilla days, were you still happy with the class, or did you always have these ideas in mind of, oh God, I wish I could go in and just overhaul everything with this class?
And do you remember what the changes were? Because I probably had some very strong opinions on them back then, but I can't remember what the changes were at this point in that upgrade. Was that where they added the talent trees for the first time?
No. So the talent trees were always there, but they tinkered with it slightly. I'd have to double check. I did mention it in the show, and I should remember. But as you say, there were a number of classes eventually got their 31-point talents changed completely, or just added to as abilities that you didn't have to invest perhaps as many points in to get, or they just removed its position on the tree. I'll double check while you talk about your early experiences with Warlocks, what the specific changes were. But do you remember being frustrated with the class at all?
Oh man, I remember thinking that Warlocks were OP as shit. That was why I loved them. Fear was incredibly powerful, and they fixed that fairly quickly by adding in the diminishing returns on fear. But Soul Link with a Fell Hunter was just the most overpowered thing in the game at the time. So you'd Soul Link to a Fell Hunter. Fell Hunters could heal themselves by stealing buffs. Players wouldn't understand what's going on and would rebuff themselves continuously, believing that, hey, they forgot to put the buff on. And so you just had this pool of healing. You took less damage, and all of your effects were basically instantaneous, being Curse of Agony, Corruption. Immolate was a very short cast time. And so that plus, fear kiting people around was just great. I remember there was this cute little graphic made for how to fight a warlock outside of Ironforge. And it consisted basically of, you need a raid group. Half of them need to hide from the AoEs, and the other half need to basically interrupt and kick him till you can kill him. But most of my experiences were dungeon running, right? Soloing and then dungeon running. And didn't even join a guild until level 60, when I joined a guild called Mediocrity on Blackrock. And I remember being taken to lower Blackrock depths to try to find the Infernal book. And that was quite the experience. So back in Classic WoW, they had this idea that you would actually have to go adventure out into the world to find spell books for your pets, spell books for your supreme abilities, which I think was just the Pit Lord, or not the Pit Lord, the Doom Guard and the Infernal. And I really liked the idea behind that, the idea that there's this epic thing you have to do, right? I also remember actually having to do the quest lines that unlocked those pets, and that was really intriguing, and it was something kind of you shared in common with the other people amongst your class, Oh, did you have a tough time on the Succubus quest? No, that one was kind of easy, but the Fell Hunter one was such a pain in the ass. And that sense of community, I would say, has probably been the biggest loss from that time and era. While we're here, right, my pet missing thing from WoW is actually some of the elite quests, right? The thing where you can't move forward with it. You have to decide, are you going to abandon this quest line or wait for a couple other people to show up and do it together, right? That created this sense of collaboration and community that you just found by seeing the same people doing the same elite quests 3 or 4 times in a row, such that you just say, oh, well, let's just friend up and we'll quest together. And that led to this social web that created a high-level network, such that when you hit max level and someone else is like, oh, hey, I've been doing Scholomance for Schoolomance. I don't remember.
Oh, we've had that debate on the show before, yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was Scholomance, and I'm pretty sure other people have called it Schoolomance, so the answer is probably everything's wrong. And that was how you got into these, difficult to join high-level groups, was just that, hey, you've been a good person, you're not completely incompetent, and you're online a lot. And when you instead play a game where you can queue up, jump into any raid group, you're never going to see these people again, it's incredibly convenient, but the convenience comes at the cost of community. And that's a really hard pill to swallow, right?
Definitely, and that's something that I'm sure a lot of people that are gravitating towards the classic project are hoping to recapture with the implementation of the way the community works in that game. Just to clean up, by the way, some of those Warlock changes in that patch 1.6 were the replacement of Master Conjurer with Master Demonologist. So we got Master Demonologist for the first time, and then things like Demonic Sacrifice was improved a little bit now that the Voidwalker will now regenerate 3% of your total health every 4 seconds, and also,
oh my god,
and also Demon Skin and Demon Armor were given to always increase health regeneration at all times, as was always intended. So that's just a few of the things.
Loved that. Okay, so probably the sacrifice for the health regen was my favorite sacrifice. That came out, and I'm like, I am never running with a pet again, right? Pets often aggroed things. I was running dungeons at that point, and so I would jump off the little balcony in Uber's, Upper Blackrock Spire, to jump down into the arena gauntlet thing, and the pet would run through all of the mobs and just bring 30 monsters into the, oh gosh, what was the name of the dragon? Rendon Gith? Was that it?
I'm not too sure.
So Rendon Gith is basically this wave and wave of little drakes and orcs, Blackrock orcs, who would come out at you. So once I had that talent, I just would sacrifice my Voidwalker and then just use that to basically be like, okay, now I can life tap infinitely. It was wonderful.
All right. Well, Alex, what we do on the show here is it's very much also a community driven show. And I've reached out to the community via the WoW Classic subreddit, and I've asked a bunch of people, a bunch of listeners to submit some questions for you personally regarding your work on the game. And luckily I got a number of replies. I also, well, funnily enough, I'm also interviewing Bo Bell and Kevin Jordan this time tomorrow. So,
they're great.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. So I've got questions for everyone specifically, and I've got just about a half a dozen questions here for you that we'll rip through for this final act of the interview. And we'll start with user Technodeep, who asked this. Alex, events as designed in World of Warcraft were awesome. However, WoW was also known for historically notable events that were created by the players, perhaps the best example being the Corrupted Blood Plague. How did these events influence your own design process later on? How did it feel from inside Blizzard, witnessing the players of the game that you developed come up with such creative ideas because of their passion for the game?
It's always fun to watch players come up with new ways of solving the problems you put in front of them. But in the case of Corrupted Blood, that was one where we really messed up, right? Because we had this raid mechanic that was supposed to evaporate when you left a zone, and due to a glitch on the data side, right, we just made a mistake and forgot to check a flag. Thousands and thousands of players were exiled from probably the tightest portion of the game, right? These big communities. Remember, Ironforge was a graveyard, and Orgrimmar was a wasteland. But that actually ended up inspiring the attack on at the launch for Northrend, right? I don't know if players remember, but there was the ability for players to turn into zombies, infect other players as zombies, and basically create a zombie plague of undead attacking the cities. It didn't quite work out as tightly as hoped, but that was the idea. Other things I remember were just the way that people would gather between Terran Mill and South Shore, right? Just they picked this arbitrary tower in the middle of nowhere. There's no particular value to it, but it gave this, fulcrum point for these assaults upon these relatively low-level, non-threatening cities that created just this permanent war zone that was fun. You just want to go and blow off some steam. You show up, you die, you're going to respawn pretty close, and you just killed other people on end for PvP practice. So I loved those type of things too.
Now, when my follow-up question from that is, when the Corrupted Blood incident hit, can you tell us what was the internal feel around the Blizzard offices when you realized what had happened? I mean, I like to tongue-in-cheek picture Mike Morhaime yelling at the top of his lungs, "I want heads on pikes for this one." What was the feeling?
I think you have a dramatically different understanding of how Blizzard works. No one ever calls for heads on pikes unless it was something really, really embarrassing.
Yeah, officially at least.
People just generally, people might bitch a little bit, but honestly, Blizzard is a family. It's like when your uncle messes up, or if it isn't something where someone is horribly hurt, you just kind of laugh it off. I remember most of us went over to Jeff's office where this is Jeff Goodman, because he'd implemented the corrupted blood ability. And we all just gathered around like, what is going on in the cities? And we just cracked up laughing because it was like, oh my God, everyone is dying. And I remember Paul Cazares and we both logged into our server just to go run over and check it out and actually watch it happen in front of us. So that was entertaining. And then Jeff's super sweet guy, kind of embarrassed, a little bit flustered, figuring out how to hotfix it, what database change needed to be made. So we all gave him shit for that for a few weeks.
Excellent. All right. Next we'll go to listener Taraka42, who asked this, and they, to be fair, directed this question both at yourself and Kevin Jordan. It might well be a better question for Kevin. I'm not sure, but I figured I'd ask you too in case you have some input as well. And they asked this. Was Protection Paladin supposed to have any role in raids? If yes, what role was it, and why do you think that spec didn't really get to see much use in raids after all? If no, what was the intended role of a Protection Paladin outside of raids? So are you able to go into that a little bit, or do you know much about that?
The simple truth was that taunt was the bread and butter ability that made raids work. Just gave a sense of definitive control, and that was only given to warrior to make sure that they had that role. Because there was a bit of fear, I would say, between this tough character, the Protection Paladin who could be tough and heal himself, that there was some fear that, he's just going to do that. That's all he's ever going to do. Not really understanding the raid dynamic or threat generation or things like that. We just didn't really get it, I would say, at that point. It's kind of that evolution, right? Between you launch the game, you barely get it out. A bunch of raids are thrown in last minute. We're talking about Molten Core here. And we're just kind of like seeing where the rocks lie. And whereas when they went into Burning Crusade, Kevin Jordan, who had been playing Prot Paladin specifically, kind of was this big champion for, hey, we really need to make them genuine tanks. We need to give them the ability to tank for real. We should give them a niche that is more unique and memorable. For example, in that case, it was AoE tank, right? They had the Consecrate ability that just was like a magnet that pulled everything onto you. And then they added the you go immune, everything pops off you, right? I think that eventually went away. They gave a 50% damage reduction version of it or something. I forgot the details at some point. To make it so that the tanking function really worked. But I just don't think we just had our heads quite wrapped around what needed to be done, or if we did, it was so late in the process, there just wasn't time to get there. I don't believe at any point the goal was for Paladin to be this sit back, spam heal type of character. I believe that the ideal vision, had it been executed, this is a question for Kevin, because this was his, his baby. Was we wanted a guy who was running in and meleeing but could throw out a few heals from time to time. And now having 10 years of experience, right, clearly the way to do that would have been make a melee class, make it a tanking class, so it has like a taunt and other things like that. I think they had the targeted taunt on the Paladin is what they ended up doing. So you could taunt things up to 3 things off of someone who is pulled aggro. And then give a instantaneous cooldown heal, such that every 20, 30 seconds you can throw out a free heal for some mana cost, but the amount of healing you do is amplified by how effectively you've been meleeing or tanking, right? That's the way you would actually build that fantasy now. It was a simpler game. We didn't have those extra raid bars that showed like the combo mechanics or the sacred power that I think Greg added. It might have been Kevin or Greg, I can't remember, added later on. That enabled those types of patterns to potentially exist. So, it's just, you're young, you're learning. And even if the people working on a game are, old or been in the industry for a while, you're all young when you make a new game. You're all discovering what that game is really going to be together. And that's kind of the most amazing experience of being on a development team, is going through these things together.
Well, the next question from user Several Napkins is in a similar vein, and I do appreciate that many of these decisions may have obviously been made or would have been made before you arrived at Blizzard, but if there's any kind of comment you can give, they ask this: were shamans and paladins largely relegated to healing to try to preserve balance between the factions? Or were fair or interesting mechanics for non-healing specs just not ironed out during vanilla? And you mentioned already that the paladin wearing cloth and just being a heal bot wasn't necessarily the plan. But in terms of shamans and paladins sort of being reduced to both healing in raids, do you know if that was like, and obviously, as you said, Paladin not planned to be that way, but were shamans planned to be that way? What was the thoughts when dealing how factions dealt with their raids and the differences between the factions?
Yeah, so I mean, the other character I played in Alpha was a shaman. His name was Adair, and they actually had some really cool talents in there that like let you wear plate or mail, or no, it was plate. You could upgrade to plate on the enhancement shaman at one point. And the idea was very much to get a parity for the number of tanks, the number of hybrid tanks, DPS, and healers across the factions. But I don't think they were relegated to healing because of the factions. It was instead the fact that the only thing players cared about was, can you heal? You will push heal. Because that is what makes us win or lose, right? And every little bit of healing pushed you further over the we lose line by extending how long the fight lasted. I thoroughly believe, and Jordan, Kevin will probably comment this with more accuracy than I do. I thoroughly believe that the intent for Shaman and for Paladin was to be that have them be by default in the fray, but they can step back and heal if they want to. There are specs that let you be better at that healing role, but I don't believe the intent was ever to just say you will only sit and heal. And instead it was the nature of how raids and raid structure worked. That was how the game worked. I'm going to look. So I spoke a little bit about how I don't really like MMOs. And the thing that I really hated the most about MMOs is probably not even a problem with MMOs innately, but rather the fact that all members in the raid are not equally engaged with the content around them, right? Imagine a world where instead Warlocks have some monsters that they need to off-tank with their pets. They need to keep their pet up and to keep doing their dots. Or where a shaman sees something on the healer, and the healer's not going to die right away, but if they can run over there, smack it a few times and pull it onto them, this makes a definitive difference in the amount of pressure and the ability of the healer to keep healing, right? Think about a world where every character interacts with the monsters and each other, and it's a way richer world, right? And I think that was kind of the world that had been hoped for. And under those eyes, all of a sudden having the enhancement shaman be a little tougher, upon having the protection paladin be able to pitch in and off tank a few things and take the pressure off of the main tank, makes a lot of sense, right? You sit back and you imagine your ideal game, and that's the kind of game that exists. Not one where everything is magnet pulled to the warrior, clumped into a giant pile, and then AoE'd by every AoE class in the game, and any class without AoE is worthless.
Did you find that you came to love MMOs a little bit more as you continue to work on the game at all?
I mean, you develop an affinity for, the content you've created and the community you've built and the colleagues you work with. But for me, I mean, I always would go back to action games. I really loved RPGs. Really loved, not the turn-based ones as much. I mean, I played my share of Final Fantasy, but really the idea of being in the world, swinging weapons, actually interacting with monsters. And I actually had this idea, like, if I was to reboot WoW, how would I build it? And, something like, well, what is the essence of a warrior? Well, a warrior charges, he has some melee swings, and he can taunt things and be really tough, right? And I was like, well, what would the 4-button version of every single class be? And it's really funny because that eventually, is the type of design that led to really strong characters for other games like Dota, which I had played a little bit, League of Legends, Dota 2, Heroes of New Earth, right? And so when those games started coming out, it seemed like a natural evolution of people realizing that you don't need to have these tons and tons of abilities to have a really rich game. And that always struck me as, man, that was like the thing that could have drawn the line between an MMO and a traditional, tank healer DPS MMO, and a game that had all the aspects of an MMO, but not the experiential qualities that these action games brought.
Okay, next we'll turn to our third last listener question from listener Brotalnia, who says this. Brotalnia, that's the one. I have a question about creature spells and abilities. During a panel at BlizzCon 2009, we were shown some screenshots of the tools that Blizzard used to make creatures. One of them was a window displaying all of Onyxia's abilities and their respective cooldowns, but there were also some additional fields for each of her spells, for which the purpose is less obvious, such as availability and probability. And even more surprisingly, there was no option to select the target on which the ability should be used. Can you talk a bit about the inner workings of creature AI in WoW and how creatures actually decided when and on who to use their abilities?
Yes, I totally can. This is basically what my first year at Blizzard was doing, was editing those fields and tweaking them. Okay, so you have to realize there were multiple parts to a creature, right? So you have the creature record, which defines how much health it is, how much damage it does. And this was basically a number. It's 1.0 for a normal creature, 2.0 for a really high damage or a high health creature, etc. So a raid boss might be a 50 or a 60, right? So the next part here is the spell record. And what you're looking at there is, a list of basically each ability. And so that's a character data sheet. I can't remember the exact record name, but it's basically a list of what spells they can cast. Then each spell, as you go to MMO Champion, you go and see the data on each spell, and each spell is all of these things and how much damage it does and how it works, etc. And then the final thing is this thing called the action list. The action list are the special hand-scripted rules that a designer created using data fields provided by the programmers. So, for example, that record you were looking at there is a list of all of Onyxia's spells. Availability is what percentage chance does she have to receive that ability when she spawns in. For example, we could create an Onyxia who has, I forget what the screaming roar, the thing that makes you run in fear. I forget the name of that. We'll just say it's Dragon Roar. So let's say you could have an Onyxia that only 10% of the time has Dragon Roar. And if you happen to spawn an Onyxia with Dragon Roar, you are really, really out of luck that week. All right. Probability is how heavily does it try to use that ability. So let's pretend that she has, I don't say deep breath, but if that's too ramped up, we'll just say that she has bite and stomp. Right? That's not real abilities, but bear with me. Mm-hmm. And probability on bite is 1 and stomp is 2. That means there is a 1 out of 3 chance that there's a dice roll from 0 to 3, mm-hmm. or 1 to 3. If it's a 1 or a 2, she's going to bite. And if it's a 3, she's going to stomp, right? Mm-hmm. That basically says, hey, the bigger that number, the more likely to choose that ability, assuming both are available. Finally, you have the cooldown. So let's say both of them are set 2 and 2, right? So they have an equal chance to happen. And one has a cooldown of 0 and the other has a cooldown of 30 seconds. What that means is you have a 50-50 chance of picking an ability. Once the ability with a cooldown is used, that ability can't be run again by Onyxia for at least 30 seconds, no matter what the cooldown of the ability is if you had possessed the creature or owned that, cast the spell manually as a designer. And this was important because we wanted the ability to mind control monsters, right? Which was an ability everyone had in their debug menu. You would mind control a monster, and then you would just press the spell record to test each ability individually, because it's really hard to test abilities otherwise. And so you would put a 0 cooldown on the spell record, and on the spell list inside the creature, you'd give the actual cooldown you wanted there. Over time, we discovered this was a really bad idea because it made it harder and harder for designers to figure out where a cooldown or where the frequency of an ability was decided. So instead, over time, we migrated away from that data and started putting it in the action records. So an ability a creature could use basically willy-nilly, and we didn't really care about how frequently you could use it. We would just put those on the record. But things we wanted to happen at 25% health or every 30 seconds on the dot, we would put into the creature action record. So now to answer your final piece of the question, which is how did it choose targeting? If it was attached to the action record, the handcrafted piece, Then there was this thing called a target rule, and this was a database value. It was never shared outside of the Blizzard databases. And it basically would say, is my target, is not my target, is far away, is close, is one of the top 3 far away, is one of the top 2 closest. And that's how it would prioritize using those abilities. This field also existed in a box called AI hints on the spell record. And this was meant for things where we had like a fireball spell that's always supposed to be cast on your current target. And we just wanted to be like, look, just always cast this on your current target. And we want all fireball spells to work the same way. So that was defined there. Are you confused yet? Good, because so was I. There was too many ways of doing the same thing. And what became best practice down the road, actually Ian Hazakostas made a really big splash on this when he came in and said, hey, look, we need to fix WoW Edit. And specifically, we need to make the rules for how to target monsters way, way easier to use. During Burning Crusade, I had sat down and written probably about 200, 300 scripts that did things like pick 1 of 3 at random, pick 1 of 4 at random, pick 1 of the healers, pick 3 of these, right? And over time, these scripts were copied, and then, pick 1 of these healers with this debuff, pick someone who doesn't have this debuff. And the amount of scripts we were writing had just sheerly exploded on the server. And it meant that when you fixed a bug in one of the scripts, you had to go and open all of the other scripts that had been made as a copy of that bug, that bug script, and modify it there. If anyone who's ever worked on a software engineering project will immediately begin wincing, because this means hours and hours of copy and paste work, hoping you don't accidentally reintroduce a bug across, what might be 100 or 200 spells. Was the guy who did most of these bug fixes. So thank you, Chris. We love you.
All right. Just coming back to boss encounters quickly, and user XY13 says this. Alex, were there any boss encounters that you worked on that you felt were pretty meh, but the players ended up loving?
That's a good question. How did you guys feel about Archimonde? I never stopped giving Joe Shelley shit about it. It's probably a little unfair because I think players enjoyed it. It was a straightforward fight. You just needed to never die. That's what I didn't like about it. I felt like I really dropped the ball on, what's the name of the guy with, he walked around, hold on. Lord Rylith. I felt like I really dropped the ball on Lord Rylith, that he could have been a much better fight. The guy who, so basically the idea was to invert the tank and DPS model. I wanted DPS to be steering the boss and tanks to be doing damage to the boss. And so the idea was tanks would drag explosive monsters over the boss to detonate him. And then DPS would attack the left foot to push the monster to the right, attack the right foot to push the monster to the left. And when we went live with that, we realized that was incredibly confusing, because the idea of using a rod and zapping a monster to, basically attack it on the right foot, run away from the right foot, didn't make sense to anybody. So we ended up having to flip that, add UI bars, make it really clear which way the monster was turning. And even then, it wasn't clear if you didn't happen to be standing behind the monster, which way he was going to turn. So I really felt like I fucked the pooch on that one. Sorry, I probably shouldn't swear.
No, please go nuts. I fucking do it all the time.
I would say that one was pretty bad. The Black Stalker was probably my first big fuck up. So, fortunately, Jeff Kaplan caught this one. For those of you who fought the Black Stalker, it was at the end of the Underbog, a little, kind of a cave structure. And this was considered a throwaway dungeon. So they were like, just do it. Just implement it. Let's see how you go. And I dramatically overspawned the thing. At one point in time, there were 32,000 little bugs, not game bugs, like actual tiny silithid that I used to create swarms of flying creatures that would run up and down a hallway inside of the Underbog. And I got a very, very tough call from an engineer who was terrified by the sheer number of bones being animated in the scene. Anyway, so the Black Stalker was this fight where you would fight the thing, and then it was this psychic mushroom creature. And that was it. That was all the things we were given by Metzen. He's like, it's a mushroom, it has tentacles, and it's psychic. Go. And all of us thought it was going to be like this floating mind flayer type of creature. And instead, we basically got a tripod from War of the Worlds. So I took a beam and said, cool. Well, what he's going to do is he's going to levitate one of the players in the air and just juggle them in air for a while. As it so happens, we didn't have the ability to do vehicle tech. So vehicle tech was the ability to basically attach a player to something else that takes control of the player and move it around in a very controlled and refined way. Mm-hmm. So instead, I was like, oh, well, we have this thing called a magnetic pull. It was basically death grip, but it could only work on players, never on monsters. So I'm like, well, I'll just put about 300 invisible NPCs in the air. And what will happen is when the Mind Flayer turns on the levitate ability, the NPCs will start pulling the player with gravity pulls and keep them suspended in midair. Well, I thought it was really clever, but this turned out to not. My thought was, they'll all pull on it. It'll stabilize to a point of equilibrium, and the player will be trapped there wherever it was. And that'd be great. It'll work. It'll be fine. Turns out it doesn't work by. You did physics class at some point, right?
Oh God, no! I'm terrible at physics, but please try and explain it like I'm a child.
I'd love to. All right, so let's imagine the basic concept of tension. I hand you a rope and you pull on it, right? The rope becomes taut, and now if you keep moving, I will get pulled along with you, right? Mm-hmm. And if we gave your significant other another rope and they pulled the other direction, you guys pulled in equal amounts of pressure, right? Basically, I'll hold still until you guys pull so hard you rip me in half, right? Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Mm-hmm. The way that this physics thing worked was, oh, cool. I'm just going to put a bunch of physics tensors, that's the term for these these springs or whatever, on a bunch of players, and it will stabilize somewhere. And I don't care where that somewhere is, but it'll be cool and it'll suspend the player in place. Instead, it worked as impulses. So impulses are basically, I walk up to you in a go-kart and I shove you, and the go-kart keeps moving, and it keeps moving until you hit something. So the net effect was, when we went in and tested the Black Stalker for the first time, everybody would be in there and it'd be fine. We'd be fighting a monster. It was kind of casting this little electric shock, and the idea was run away, don't stand next to other people. Fine. And then all of a sudden, one person would get pulled up in the air and they would go flying through the dungeon as these 300, 400 invisible stalkers, probably 30 or 40, just are spamming these physics effects on them, accelerating them so fast that they literally were juggled so hard. I think Kaplan came in and said that he started retching from the camera whiplash that he had during this fight.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was pretty embarrassing. And the resolution was to have one stalker pull once, and then there was a bug in the game where if you applied a root effect, like a Frost Nova or a Chains of Ice or an Entangling Roots effect from a druid, gravity would be turned off on the character. So instead we couldn't. So instead we would do a gravity effect, which would put a timer on the character, and after 3 seconds, that invisible stalker would remember who he cast the pull effect on and put a root on them. The problem with that was that this meant it was uncertain how far or how high in the air the player would be pulled. Sometimes it would pull you up 10 feet in the air. Everyone could see you and it would be fine. Other times it would pull you 30 or 40 yards in the air because physics was inconsistent at that point in the game. And you would basically have to stand directly under the player in order to heal them. And unfortunately, that's what went live. So players started clumping up and clustering underneath the person who was pulled into the air. And I stuck a little yellow beam from the stalker to the suspended person. But the other effect in that fight was a AoE damage effect for anyone who was clumped up. So that was kind of a train wreck.
Okay. Well, no, thank you for the analogy. Now, here's the question that I'll ask just to sort of tie everything all together with the theme of this show. And listeners will be jumping up and down going, Josh, for fuck's sake, why haven't you asked anything about Classic yet? And obviously with this being a Classic podcast, let's really sort of finish this interview strong with some of your thoughts on Classic through this listener question from Holland45, who says, Alex, do you think that what do you think of the future success or failure of Classic WoW? I'd love to hear if you think that the product that you helped create will stand up in today's market, or whether it's a nostalgia-based cash grab by Blizzard. What do you think?
Oh, goodness. If it was just a cash grab, Blizzard wouldn't have done it because, they're doing great with Overwatch and Hearthstone. They are not dying for cash at this point. Well, obviously, they want to try things. Basically, the reason this is happening is because enough players have been pushing for it long enough that eventually one of the engineers, Brian Birmingham, said, I'm going to just check out some of the code and grab a couple of engineers and see if we can make it happen. And they were able to build it and get it working and say, well, it's not impossible. What is the real work we have to do? And then it was a really tough decision by, the leads of the WoW team to say, all right, how many people are we going to put on this project? What is the goals? How is it going to turn out? And I don't know. I really do think it is a strong nostalgia attachment, but at the same time, I also see the structural differences between, systems design and technical design is what I do. Or did at that point. So I see how much has changed, right? And there's a strong sense of going back and playing the game that you played a long time ago that you really connected with. So I see the value in that. It feels like a box product to me, right? Here's my $40. I will go and play this for a while. I don't know how you continue this loop going on forever though, right? I mean, do you make it seasonal? Does it spin up and you get to play WoW and Classic and one patch is released every month for the next 9 months, and then a raid tier opens up, and then when it finishes it moves forward into Burning Crusade and they keep going? Does it instead reset and it's sort of like a season in Diablo 3 and you just experience it and then you reset, and it's basically a race to see who can master these old pieces of content and level up fast enough and quick enough? And when I look at all of those, I have to admit, from a business perspective, I think this is really more of a Blizzard love letter to their players than it is a great product decision. I know, I'm sorry, your players will hate on me for this one, but I think it's that they care about you, they like you, and if this is an experience you want, they're providing it to you more than, hey, this is going to bring players back and they're going to stay with the game forever. I mean, how many times can you run Classic WoW? I mean, I did it once at the slow pace for every single class once, and then I did it a couple times in both factions to do all of the quests, at which point, there's just only so much stuff you can do. I don't know. It's really tricky. I think they do it because they love you and they care about you and they want to give you the chance to do what you want. But ultimately, you guys are going to decide what happens with it. Does it become a seasonal product? Does it become something that is more of an archiving of an era, right? Just this product to prove out how good the experience is. Does it dry up on the vine? I don't know. It's kind of exciting to watch.
It's fascinating. And like you say, we're all trying to stare into the same crystal ball and it's very murky. But in saying that, have you heard anything about Classic? Is any rumors, scuttlebutt into industry gossip that you've spoken about with people?
I have some of the conversations I've had with some of the developers working on it, but I would never betray their trust, right? Blizzard is an old family and you want to give them the chance to present their work. And just even what little bit just isn't fair to leak out.
Oh, definitely. Sorry, I meant more like the former crew. Do you guys get together and gossip about it?
We really don't. We tend to get together and talk more about the life experiences, Pat Nagel's old car that he used to drive around, it's more about the friendship and the people connections for us than a specific product. I think for a lot of us, though, actually we learned a lot by reading the questions that John posted up in his AMA, because he had been writing this stuff down forever. There was a joke board and all sorts of inside humor that I'm sure will never see light of day. And seeing that all just kind of brought back that experience of working together and collaborating. That it's frankly magical. And you don't get to work on your first game more than a few times, right?
We got some huge news about 48 hours ago with the announcement that we're going to be getting a playable demo at BlizzCon, that not only will it be available on the floor of BlizzCon for attendees to play, but also people who buy a virtual ticket will be able to play at home. With the news,
yes,
did you see that?
Yeah, it actually popped up in my news, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
Definitely, and it's unprecedented. It's something that Blizzard have said they haven't done before, and they're obviously trying to break some new ground with this one. With that being said, though, and knowing what you know about game development, if you had to guess when we would get Classic finally delivered to us, ready to go, what would your closest to the pin guess be now, knowing that we're getting a demo soon?
Oh man, they're putting the demo up at BlizzCon. I mean, this sounds like they're trying to ship for either end of November or late March, right? Something like within that window. Because there is always the, hey, here's the demo, but it's actually the full product. Play it for a couple hours, and then we're going to cap you at level 20, and then you come and buy it. Type of allure. I think companies love to do it when they can. This doesn't feel like that, right? It doesn't quite have the right notes. But Blizzard doesn't like to, ever since the Burning Crusade announcement, where they took way too long to be able to actually ship the game from announcing it, they've dedicated themselves to bring their announcements as close to release as they reasonably can. So I would actually take a time measure of how long between release announcing Legion beta and launching Legion, and I would divide that by half, right? And just say it's probably going to be around that long from now. So my guess is probably about 9 months.
About 9 months from now.
Yeah, 6 to 9 months, somewhere in there.
Okay.
It's either going to be a full-on surprise, which I really doubt. It doesn't, they would literally have said, come to BlizzCon, and we're going to literally just let you have a 3 days of WoW. They would have said that. So my guess is, 6 to 9 months.
Okay, so when you say like that November to March window, are you saying that's if they went the option of just dropping that complete surprise on us, going, ta-da, it's actually ready?
Yeah. Yeah, but this doesn't feel like that. Like I love Blizzard, but they are really bad about not announcing everything the moment it's ready to drop. One of my issues with raid releases in the past has been raid releases happen too soon, immediately after after the expansion launches. Like, expansion launch, and then first raid is going a week later. You don't really need that, right? You have over a month and a half, if not 2 months of content ready to go. But Blizzard just they're driven by people who love their players. And so they want to give everything they have to the players as quick as it's ready. And so if the game was ready or the game was coming out in a few months, that would be the announcement here. Not hey, you're going to be able to download. What will probably be the first 20 levels would be my guess, something like that.
Well, they've said they're giving us two sort of iconic zones, and the implication has been perhaps either Elwood Forest and Durotar or Westfall and the Baron, something of that nature.
Yeah, it's probably Elwyn plus Westfall. It'll probably be the whole pipe up to dungeon running, because that is probably what they want to test, right? And so they'll have a similar sort of thing on the Horde side. I'm not sure which Horde zone had a dungeon at the end of it. I think it was RFK, right? No, not RFK. It was there's one under Orgrimmar, right?
If they do happen to give us the Barrens, then obviously you've got like Wailing Caverns in there. It just depends. But knowing that they've got this demo sort of cooked up and ready to go, and you say 9 months from now is perhaps when we could potentially expect it, and that would fall in line with my personal guess, which I've been saying for a little while now, and I base this on absolutely nothing. I am far from a game developer. I've just been saying summer 2019. That's falls in line with school holidays. I don't know. It just seems about right. John's guess was obviously, when John Stats came on, he's been saying perhaps 2020 plus, because there is so much work that would go into the project. But just focusing on this demo, just focusing on the demo and it being released on us. Now, I don't know, you might be able to shed some more light on this, because people have been arguing, well, what's the process these days? Does it go alpha, beta, demo, or demo, alpha, beta? What do you think?
I mean, it's weird, right? Because they already know what the content is. It's mostly going to be bug fixing and basically all of these unknowns, right? Of the hybrid between the improved server code and probably some of the improved graphics code with the old assets is going to just be, we literally just need eyes on this and to see how bad the load is. One of the problems with the old WoW servers, right? They didn't handle load as well as the new one is. That's probably something they've tried to improve. Anyways, John might be right. If literally the amount of content is, all right, let's pretend that the only thing they have done is Durotar and Elwyn, then yeah, he's right. It'll be the 2020, 2021. But if it's like the engine works and they're just bringing in additional content, it could be sooner than that. So, I hate to say it, but John's probably more right than I am, but I have no insider information. I'm just kind of a little too optimistic, I think.
Fair enough. But if I can restore a little bit of hope after that last comment for the listeners, when you say if the framework is done, then it might be a bit more of a streamlined or simplified task at hand. What can you say about that? Because people have said, look, if we're getting a demo, it means that the client might be done, the building blocks are there. Now it's just simple data entry, putting that final paint job on all the zones. What do you think about that?
Data entry is most of the work, man.
Yeah.
So I have two perspectives on it. One, Razorfen Crawl worked all the way until Cataclysm, right? It worked for years and years and years with moderate tweaking and bug improvements, right? So and that was without a lot of overhauls on it. It was a very simple zone. It was very focused on non-scripted features. So it might be that it's not that big of a deal. There's some code in there that they can just bring back in. The other alternative is that they backported the existing engine and are putting the game content in from scratch, right? Or importing it and then playing it and then fixing all the bugs and hoping they caught everything. That is a monster amount of work, right? That is months and months of QA time. That is probably where another year to 2 years is coming at it. And I just don't know. It'll be pretty, I think it'll be clear what's going on once we actually get the demo in hand. But yeah, I'm actually rolling it all back now because I'm sitting here and thinking, how long does it take me to change and test one script or one dungeon? How many years? And not even knowing which data model I'm designing against, right? I would be making so many mistakes. You basically have to relearn how to write the scripting system. If it's using the old scripting engine, if it's using the new scripting engine, you basically need to update everything to be the less buggy version of it. And that's a lot of work. And just trusting the old systems is probably not a wise call either. So,
okay.
Yeah, sorry. I'm gonna be bearish on this one. I think that it's likely that they've got the graphics engine working. They've started working with the content. They probably got an editor that handles the data, the old data and the new data very well. But I'm guessing probably the content they're showing is the content they have plus or minus 2 zones.
Okay, fair enough. Now, from there, I would say one last question and a big debate. I'm not sure if you followed any of this nonsense that's been going on around the classic development, but the community sort of up in arms about, will Blizzard change the game at all? Is anything going to be different, or is it going to be a carbon copy of what we had sort of towards the tail end of vanilla? Do you think Blizzard would change the game at all, or do you think they'd be more inclined to deliver it as it was?
They're going to change something. So there's going to be BattleNet integration for sure.
Mm-hmm.
You need the ability to still chat with your friends, and you're still going to, I don't know that they would actually go with the whole queued dungeons. I suspect they won't, just to see how that plays out. But there's other systemic features in there, the bug reporting, how to talk to a GM, right? All of that, they're not going to use the tools from 10 years ago, right? It just wouldn't work. So all of that will definitely be changed. Then in terms of like technical details, if they have a better graphical engine, they're really not going to lose much out by using the same engine with higher performance and just using the old assets with the old shader logic, or even rewriting the old shaders. So that will be similar, but I suspect might be slightly off. I don't know. Scott Harden is an incredibly talented man, and if he wants that shader to look exactly like it did before, he's still there, and he probably remembers the code to do it. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's going to be a little eerie. It's going to be like, holy shit, I'm walking around to the old model Zorgrimmar. but everything's a slightly different color if you take a screenshot type of thing. So We'll see.
Are you going to play it or are you done?
Dude, that's a hard call. I will probably play the demo. I mean, it's for everyone who's going to BlizzCon, right? So I still go to BlizzCon when I can, just to see friends and reconnect with colleagues. So I'll definitely check it out there. The main thing for me, right, is just time. Right now I'm working on 4 game projects, a design course, and a couple other personal things that just started happening in my own life. And it's just a lot of time to play a game like WoW, especially if they're going back to the old grind, which I think is a lot of the appeal for the classic WoW players. They enjoyed that slow pace of the game. I just don't have that time. I don't want to commit that kind of time in my life. I've spent, like, as much as I love the nostalgia, I've spent 10 years of my life between being a player, being a developer, and then after being a developer, continuing to play the game. And I just don't need to dedicate any more than that decade at this point. I've been writing blogs for probably about 2 or 3 years worth of time about the content I made, mostly to remind myself the lessons that I learned and teach the people who come after me how to understand why we made the decisions we did. And it just feels like, how much is enough, right? How much is enough to give? And I think a decade is sufficient.
Okay. Well, look, if you're at BlizzCon this year, I will see you there. Please, you'll have to come and find me. I'll have to buy you a drink to say thank you for giving me so much time today for this interview. Alex, look, just one last time, if you'd like to, please feel free, plug away for your website and your work. Where can people find you?
Yeah. Hey guys, I would love to teach the next generation of game designers, right? That's kind of my next goal. If you're interested, please hit me up on Twitter. I'm collecting a backlist to kind of like filter and find the next 10 game designers for my game design apprenticeship course. I've been doing this on and off for 3 years. I do it about once a year. And I've had some incredibly talented people. Some have ended up at Blizzard on the narrative team. Others have gone on to make their own games. And I would love to, try to find the few, the next gems to not only work at Blizzard, but work on your own games and move your own vision forward. If you're interested, hit me up, alex@zelnath.com, or just @zelnath on Twitter. I am working on trying to get more than 10 people in by kind of changing how the course is structured and making things a little more accessible. So if you're interested or you want to find out, hit me up and we'll get you on the list. And then we'll bring you in for interviews and see if you're ready to take on the next step in your design career. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, look, everyone, please do take Alex up on that. Go and check out his work. Feel free to obviously get in touch with him if you've got any more questions. And Alex, thank you so much one more time for coming on the show and affording me the last 2.5 hours of your time. I've got to run now. It's 9:30 in the morning here in Australia. It's my girlfriend's birthday. She woke up about an hour ago. She is going to kill me if I don't get off this call soon. So thank you so much one more time.
You're lucky to have someone who's that important in your life, man. Embrace it. Never forget it.
Will do. Mate, we'll speak to you later and I'll look out for you at BlizzCon.
Me too at BlizzCon, man. Looking forward to it.
And that's the call with Alex, and thank you so much again to him for taking that time out for Countdown to Classic and all the listeners worldwide. I hope all of you enjoyed that chat, and in fact, all of the developer interviews that the show has featured these past 3 episodes as much as I did, as the curtain continues to get pulled back even further on the making of World of Warcraft. I hope that's not the last time Countdown to Classic speaks to former developers of the game, and I'll be sure to try to get even more on the show later on as we continue to network a little bit further and try to get more of those voices from Blizzard on the show. Now, that's the show for today. Countdown will be back later in the week to play you a chat I had with several listeners of the show regarding BlizzCon predictions and what our hopes and dreams are for the panels and the demo. And today I actually got some amazing news about BlizzCon in that I was able to secure a press pass for the event. So I'll see how I go with that, and it was certainly some fantastic news to receive today, and I'm even more excited now for an event that I was already absolutely busting for, considering the big trip that I'm making over there from Australia. But just before I let you go, I just want to shout out to some very dedicated patrons of Countdown to Classic. So big shout out to Flozy B, Palfurus, Permadrunk, Rarebit, Romani, the Anton, Wilson, Mara, Valaco, and also Tsunami. Big shout out to Tsunami. I really must apologize to her. I am so sorry for unfortunately leaving her name off the list for the last 10 to 12 episodes. She very much so should have been there. She is a huge supporter of the show. I do apologize. I was using an old list to read from that I was copying and pasting wrong, and I've spoken to her and said I am very, very sorry. But if you're not aware, Tsunami is one of the dedicated mods over at the Countdown to Classic Discord, and she does such a fantastic job over there helping me out with everything when you guys all chat together on the show's Discord. And she has been a very, very early supporter of the show. She'll be there with me at Countdown to Classic with all the mods, actually, and I can't wait to meet up with her and say thank you for all the amazing work that she has done. So Tsunami, very special shout out to you. Thank you again. I do apologize for leaving you off that list for the last few episodes. Now, also a big thank you to Bossman764, Hurlbert, Goodkisser, Myrtlebanks, Purgatos81, Tim B, and Zudamos, as always. All of you, thank you so much for your phenomenal support of the show. You all know that Countdown to Classic would not be the same without your support. But that's it from me for the day, everyone. So signing off from Down Under. Have a great start to the week, everyone.